Australia, Lord Harrington says, rolling the word around his mouth like it's something he stepped in. A continent of convicts and kangaroos. Really, it's perfect for you. The whole drawing room laughs. Not a polite laugh either. The kind that comes with raised glasses and turned backs. The kind aristocrats have been perfecting for 600 years. My father stands by the window and does not laugh, which is somehow worse, because my father not laughing is my father agreeing. And here's the thing, not one of these powdered, port-soaked lords could possibly understand. I asked for this. They're laughing because of a newspaper. 3 days ago, an anonymous article ran in the Times. It said the gold standard was a corpse that hadn't finished falling over. It said Germany and America would pass the empire inside 20 years while London admired its own reflection. It named the coal, the steel, the ships, the exact decade it all goes wrong. Extremely rude, extremely correct. I wrote it. Because I'm Alexander, grandson of Queen Helena, son of the Duke of Edward, and, the part that matters, not actually from here. I went to sleep once as a man who knew how the next 100 years turn out, and woke up a prince in 1890 with the whole disaster still ahead of everyone in this room but me. So I told the truth in the loudest place I could find, and signed it with nothing, and it took Uncle Harry 2 days to trace the style back to me through Professor Thornton. Good detective work for a man whose main skills are cigars and mistresses. So now my father wants me gone. India, he's thinking, somewhere warm and far and quiet where a disgraced prince can rot in linen and never embarrass the family again. Which is why I'm looking at the map. The whole empire is spread out on the wall in that smug imperial pink, a quarter of the planet colored like a birthday cake. India, the jewel. Canada, the reliable eldest son. Africa, the ongoing argument. And down in the bottom corner, almost falling off the edge of the world, this enormous empty island nobody in this room would cross the street for. 6 squabbling colonies. 3 railway gauges that don't connect. A population that thinks of itself as British people who got unlucky about the weather. The most useless piece of the whole map. I put my finger on it. I want to go to Australia, I say. The laughter stops. Then it starts again, louder, because they think I'm joking, or broken, or both. Lord Harrington does his convicts and kangaroos bit, and the room eats it up. Fine, laugh. In every one of your heads, I'm a boy running away to the ends of the earth because he can't show his face in a London club anymore. In my head, I'm looking at the largest deposit of gold on the planet, a coastline that could hold a navy, iron and coal sitting in the same ground waiting to become steel, and 8 million square kilometers with nobody's foot on the brake. They think they're exiling me. They're handing me a country. I let them laugh. I've found that letting people laugh is one of the most powerful things you can do, because a man laughing at you is a man who has stopped watching his own pockets. I bow, very correctly, the perfect wounded prince, and I leave them to their port. Kangaroos and convicts. I'm going to make them eat those 2 words with a silver fork in this exact room, and I'm going to be smiling when they do. But first, I have to get past my grandmother. Osborne House smells like beeswax and old empire. You don't get an appointment with Queen Helena so much as you get summoned into her gravity. And I walk into that room knowing that everything, the whole plan, the next 25 years, the entire shape of my second life, comes down to whether one small, black-clad, permanently unimpressed woman decides I'm worth the risk. She lets me stand there a while first. She's good at that. They tell me, she finally says, that my grandson has decided to humiliate his family in the newspapers and then flee to the penal colonies. Have I got the shape of it? Nearly, grandmother. I don't sit. You don't sit. I've decided to save the family. The newspaper was research. One eyebrow. In a woman who rules a quarter of the world, one eyebrow is a full cross-examination. So I give it to her. Not the sulky prince version, the real one. I tell her the empire is a magnificent old ship with a crack below the waterline nobody wants to look at. I tell her the future isn't in India's cotton or Africa's gold, it's in steel and coal and electricity and ships that don't exist yet, and that whichever nation builds that future first owns the next century. And then I tell her about the empty continent at the bottom of the map, 6 colonies too small to matter, sitting on more coal, iron, and gold than any of them has bothered to count. I don't want to hide in Australia, I say. I want to weld it into one nation, heavy industry on its own coal and iron, a navy built in its own yards. One country where 6 arguments used to be. an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Empire, anchored in the Pacific, paid for by nobody in this room. I don't actually explain what an aircraft carrier is. Some things you save for later. She's quiet for a long time. The clock does that heavy Osborne house ticking. And then something moves in her face, something I did not plan for and could not have planned for, and her voice goes very slightly rough. "You sound like him," she says. "You sound like your grandfather." Albert saw the whole world as a thing that could be built better, and no one in that great exhibition believed him either until they walked inside and wept. She looks at me like she's deciding whether to hope, which for a widow of 30 years is an expensive thing to spend. "There is no Commonwealth of Australia," she says. "There is no such office. You understand that. You would be Governor General of a country that does not exist." "Then I'll build the country under my own feet," I say, "and the office will have to catch up." And Queen Helena, Empress of India, the most powerful woman who has ever lived, makes a country out of nothing but a sentence. "Then go and make it," she says. "First Governor General of the Commonwealth of Australia." Her hand tightens on the head of her cane. "And Alexander, do not disgrace the name of Albert. I have buried enough." I bow, and for the first time since I woke up in this century, someone believes me, and it costs me something I didn't expect it to. A country that doesn't exist yet, a grandmother who buried the only man who ever dreamed as big as I'm about to, and a whole ocean between me and the first shovel. I've got a nation to build out of 6 arguments and an empty map. I'm going to need a crew of lunatics. Turns out, lunatics are easy to find. If you go looking in exactly the places respectable people throw them away. I spend a week in the Kensington Library first, because before you hire anyone, you should know what's actually broken. And what's broken about Australia isn't the land, it's the head. 6 colonies that each think of themselves as an island. Sydney doesn't trust Melbourne. Melbourne looks down on everyone. Perth thinks the whole eastern coast is a rumor, and none of them can agree on so much as the width of a railway track. You can't build a nation out of 6 people all facing away from each other. First, you have to turn them around. For that, I need men who are already outcasts, because outcasts don't have a colony to be loyal to. They're only loyal to the work. Recruit number 1 is at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, and I find him by asking who the other officers laugh at. His name is Thomas Clark, and his great crime is that he wrote a paper arguing the colonies should stop maintaining 6 tiny useless armies and build one real one with a unified command. Every general in Britain filed this under amusing and moved on. I read it twice. The man had basically designed a national defense force for a nation that didn't exist, which as far as I'm concerned makes us colleagues. I offer him the thing no one else ever will. Not a promotion. A blank page. Every army you've ever served has told you your best ideas are too big, I tell him. I'm offering you a continent and a clean sheet of paper. Design the whole thing. From nothing. Clark, who has spent his entire career being the smartest man in rooms that resented him for it, goes very still. And then he says the only sane thing a soldier can say to a madman offering him an army. When do we sail? Recruit number 2 doesn't want a navy. He wants money to behave. Professor Edward Thornton, Cambridge, the sharpest economic mind in Britain and completely unemployable as anything but a lecturer because his ideas frighten bankers. I don't offer him a bank. I offer him the bank. A central bank of Australia, an Australian pound backed not by London's promises, but by our own gold and wool and iron pulled out of our own ground. He listens to the whole thing without a word. Then he takes off his glasses, cleans them very slowly, puts them back on, and looks at me the way a man looks at a beautiful, dangerous idea he already knows he's going to say yes to. "You are a devil," Professor Thornton says. "You are a devil dressed as a prince, and you have designed a temptation specifically for me, and I find I cannot refuse it. 2 down, a general with no army and a banker with no bank. My kind of people. But before I leave London, I want to see the thing I'm about to try to beat, up close, with the polish scraped off. So I put on a plain coat, borrow a working man's cap, and I take Clark to look at the greatest arsenal in the world. The Woolwich Arsenal is hell with a roof on it. Not the clean, thundering hell of the recruitment posters, the other kind. The foundry floor is a red-black cavern where men move through heat that hits you like a wall from 30 feet away, and the great 13.5-inch guns for the Majestic-class battleships hang in their cradles like the bones of something that eats ships for a living. It's the most powerful machine the Empire owns, and I stand there in my borrowed cap doing the math on exactly how dead it already is. Because I know what's coming. I know that within 15 years, one ship, all big guns, turbine engines, a thing called a dreadnought, is going to walk onto the ocean and turn every single one of these magnificent battleships into scrap metal overnight. Every navy on Earth is about to be reset to zero at the same instant, and the country that's ready for that reset, instead of mourning the fleet it just lost, wins the century. That's the good part. That's the part that makes me want to run to the boat. Then I see the other thing. There's an overseer down on the floor with a length of leather in his hand, and he's using it on a man who's moving too slow in that heat, and nobody looks up. Not one man on that floor lifts his head. In the greatest arsenal in the world, human beings are just the softest, cheapest part of the machine, the part you whip when it slows down, the part you replace when it breaks. And that, right there, is the whole thing. That's the seam I'm going to build a country inside of. They think this is an achievement, I tell Clark, quiet, as we walk out into cold, clean London air that has never felt so good in my lungs. It isn't. It's an instruction manual, and half the instructions are wrong. Newcastle will make better steel than this, Wollongong will pour it cleaner, and we will do it without a man on the floor being whipped, because the difference between them and us, the whole difference, the only one that matters, is that to them the men are the fuel, and to us the men are the point. Clark doesn't answer right away. He's a soldier, he's spent 30 years around power, but he looks back at that red doorway, and then at me, and I watch him finally understand that I am not talking about a colony. I'm talking about beating the thing that made us. Your Highness, he says slowly, how big is this actually going to be? I look south, toward a continent that doesn't have my footprint on it yet. Bigger than anyone in that building could survive imagining, I tell him. Now come on, I've got one more madman to hire, and this one's the maddest of all. The maddest of all is drinking coffee alone in a cheap East End cafe, drawing lightning on a napkin, and every other patron in the place is very deliberately not looking at him. Dragan Sokolov is, at this exact moment in history, a genius nobody has decided to believe yet. He's got the whole future folded up in his head, alternating current, machines that talk without wires, power that arrives out of the empty air, and he's got about enough money for the coffee. The men who could fund him think he's a lunatic. They're not entirely wrong, they're just wrong about which kind. I sit down across from him in my plain coat, and I don't waste his time with small talk, because a man like Sokolov can smell a time waster from across a room. Dr. Sokolov, I say, the men in this city think in wires. I want to talk to you about a continent with none. He looks up. Careful, he's been disappointed by well-dressed men before, so I don't sell him a job. I sell him the dream he can't say out loud in London without being laughed out of the room. A national electrical laboratory that's actually his. No board, no investors clutching their pearls. A single alternating current grid strung across an entire continent. Not a city, a continent. Every town and mine and port lit from the same living web. And past that, the thing he really wants, the thing that keeps him up at night. Power and voice and signal thrown through the air with no wire at all, from one end of the world to the other. I watch it happen. I watch a man who has spent years being the smartest, loneliest person in every room realize he's finally talking to someone who isn't nodding politely and waiting for him to stop. You describe things, Sokolov says slowly, that I have only ever said to myself. Then stop saying them to yourself. I put a check on the table and a first-class ticket to Sydney next to it. Come and build them where the sky is empty and nobody's told the air it can't carry a human voice. He doesn't touch the check. He touches the ticket. That's how I know I've got him. And that's the core of it. A general, a banker, a wizard. But a nation runs on the unglamorous ones too, so I fill out the crew with the people other men overlook. A supply officer who kept an army fed across the veldt in the Boer War and got thanked with a desk. A German combustion engineer who believes in the internal combustion engine at a time when polite society believes in the horse. An agronomist who thinks you can grow wheat where God clearly intended dust. Outcasts, every one. Loyal to the work because the work is the only place that ever wanted them. I've got my lunatics. Now I just have to get us all to the far side of the earth without my family talking me out of it. The docks at Southampton are cold and gray, and my whole family has turned out to watch me leave, which in this family is less a farewell and more a formal inspection of the thing being thrown away. My father shakes my hand like we're concluding a business transaction he's relieved to be done with. Uncle Harry presses a box of cigars into my hands and leans in with the closest thing to fondness he's capable of. "A word of advice, nephew," he murmurs. "Wherever you're going, don't leave souvenirs." From Harry, that passes for a blessing. And then the crowd goes quiet and parts, because my grandmother has come to the dock herself. Queen Helena does not do docks. Queen Helena has not stood on a public quay in living memory, and yet here she is, small and black and absolute, and every man on that pier has taken off his hat without being told. She looks up at me for a long moment, and then, quietly, so only I can hear it, "You are going a very long way, to a place that will try to make you forget what you are. Remember it. Before you are their governor, before you are anything they invent for you, you are a Windsor. You are mine." "I won't forget, grandmother." "No, you won't." And she presses something into my hand, small and heavy and wrapped in cloth. I unwrap the corner. It's a lump of dark iron, pitted and strange, and it takes me a second to understand what I'm holding. Meteorite iron. Metal that fell out of the sky. "It was your grandfather's," she says. "Albert used to say it came from a place with no borders at all. He'd have liked what you're trying to do. He'd have been the only one." She closes my fingers over it. "Now go, before I change my mind about all of it." The Britannia's horn goes, and I stand at the rail as the only country I've ever known slides backward into the fog, holding a piece of the sky in one fist and a continent's worth of promises in the other. And I do not look away until England is gone. 6 weeks of open ocean between here and Sydney. 6 weeks with nothing to do but turn a boat full of misfits into a government. So that's exactly what I do. The Britannia becomes the strangest university that ever put to sea. Every morning after breakfast, we take over the first-class lounge, and it stops being a lounge and becomes a war room. Clark spreads charts of the sea lanes across the card tables and drills the same terrifying fact into all of us until we can recite it in our sleep. Without the Suez Canal, Australia isn't a link in the empire's chain, it's an island at the bottom of the world, and an island that can't feed and arm and fuel itself is just a large, slow target. "Self-sufficiency isn't a preference," he says, tapping the empty blue around the continent. "It's the whole game. Everything they can cut, we have to be able to make." Thornton takes the afternoons. He talks about money the way a doctor talks about blood, not as numbers, but as something that has to circulate or the whole body dies. "A nation's currency is its heartbeat," he says. "London's pound beats for London. Yours will have to beat for you, and it will have to be backed by something you can put your hand on, not their faith. Our gold, our wool, our iron in the ground." And I sit in the middle of it and quietly drop seeds. A network of reservoirs up and down the Murray and the Darling, water banked against the droughts I know are coming. One standard railway gauge from coast to coast, so a train that leaves Sydney can actually arrive in Perth without everyone getting out and changing trains at a colonial border like it's the 1840s. Sokolov's grid humming under all of it, tying the whole thing together with light. By the time the coast of New South Wales finally rises out of the sea, we are not a group of passengers anymore. We're a cabinet that hasn't been sworn in yet, for a country that hasn't been born yet, sailing straight into the middle of it. Sydney does not do anything by halves, and it turns out that includes welcoming a prince. The harbor is packed. Every wharf, every rooftop, every small boat that floats is full of people. And when the Britannia comes through, the heads a 21-gun salute goes off that I feel in my chest before I hear it. It's the kind of welcome that would go straight to a lesser man's head, and I make a private note to never once let it go to mine, because a crowd that cheers you in this decibel range is a crowd that will absolutely turn up to boo you later if you get lazy. Waiting for me at the bottom of the gangway is a man I've been looking forward to and slightly dreading in equal measure, Sir Henry Parkes. Nearly 80 years old, a mane of white hair and a beard like an Old Testament prophet, and known up and down the coast as the father of Federation, mostly because he's been shouting about Federation for a decade while 6 colonies politely ignore him. He takes my measure with a pair of pale, unimpressed eyes. He's buried more clever young men's promises than I've made in my life, and it shows. "So," Parkes says, gripping my hand, The Queen sends us a prince. I've a constitutional convention opening in Sydney inside the month, and half the men attending it would rather burn the building down than share a currency. Tell me, Your Highness, did she send you to rule us or to lecture us? The crowd is close enough to hear. This is a test, and it's a public one, and the old man knows exactly what he's doing. Neither, Sir Henry, I say, loud enough to carry. She sent me to work with you. I didn't come 8,000 miles to sit above this country. I came to get underneath it and help you lift. Something in the old prophet's eyes shifts. Not trust, not yet. He's far too old for that. But interest. The look of a man who has finally, after a very long wait, then handed a tool that might not break in his hand. We'll see, Park says. God help us both. We'll see. 1 month to the convention. 6 colonies that won't share a railway, let alone a country. And an 80-year-old prophet watching to find out if I'm the real thing or just a better-dressed disappointment. Time to show them what a strong Australia actually looks like, and I'm going to start, of all places, with a card game. The card game is a real card game, which is the part everyone underestimates. I get Parks and Edmund Barton. Parks for New South Wales, Barton, the rising star from Helena. The 2 men who between them can carry or kill anything at the convention, into a quiet study, and I deal cards, and I pour drinks, and for the first hour we genuinely just play, because you learn more about a man in 40 minutes of cards than in 40 speeches. Then, somewhere around the second hand, I stop dealing and put a different kind of card on the table. Gentlemen, a train leaves Sydney tonight for Melbourne. Where does it stop? Barton, who is sharp, sees the trap and walks into it anyway because it's true. The border, different gauge. Everyone gets off. Everyone changes trains. 6 colonies, 3 railway gauges. You cannot run a single load of freight across your own country without unloading it twice. I let that sit. You don't have a nation, gentlemen. You have 6 waiting rooms that share an ocean. Parks bristles. He's been father of Federation for 10 years and doesn't love being told his baby's ugly. And I suppose the prince has a solution he'd like to sell us. I have gold, I say. That gets very quiet. Because here's the thing I know, and they only half suspect. Out west, at a place called Kalgoorlie, there is more gold in the ground than any of them has dared to count. The largest deposit on the face of the planet, sitting under the red dirt of a colony that thinks of itself as a rumor. And gold is the one thing on Earth that makes 6 arguments suddenly discover they were always brothers. So I lay out the machine, a Royal Australian mining company to pull the Kalgoorlie gold out of the ground. Every ounce of the profit flows into a federal infrastructure fund. And that fund builds one thing first, a national railway, 1 gauge, coast to coast, that stitches the whole continent into a single body. And then I tell them the part that makes it a nation instead of a robbery. Who owns the shares? The Crown 30%, New South Wales 20%, Helena 20%, Western Australia, whose dirt it actually is, 15%, the small colonies split 10%, and 5% to the men who run it, so competence has skin in the game. And the capital, I add, before either of them can start fighting over it, will be neither Sydney nor Melbourne. Both men open their mouths. I keep going. A new city, built from nothing, on the border between you, belonging to neither of you, and therefore to all of you. You've spent 10 years unable to federate because neither of you will bow to the other's town. So we'll build a town that makes both of you bow to the country instead. Barton sits back. Parks stares at the cards like they've rearranged themselves into something he waited 80 years to see. Nothing on this earth, I tell them, unites men faster than gold they all own a piece of. 2 of the 3 most powerful men in the colonies just watched me turn their oldest, ugliest problem into a company they want stock in. Which leaves the third, and the third is the hard one, because the third is sitting on the actual gold and trusts the eastern colonies about as far as he can throw the Nullarbor. Perth doesn't feel like the rest of Australia. Perth feels like the edge of the world, which it more or less is, and its premier feels exactly the same way about the men in Sydney. Sir Robert Menzies is a slab of a man who made his name walking across deserts that killed other explorers. And he did not survive the Great Sandy just to hand his colony's fortune to a bunch of dandies on the far coast. So I don't go myself, not first. I send 2 men ahead, James Cook, a young geologist with ice in his blood and no talent whatsoever for lying, and Edward Hamilton, a diplomat who could talk a snake out of its skin. Cook does the first half of the job by simply telling the truth. He lays his survey on Menzies' desk and says the Kalgoorlie lode runs more than 50 kilometers, that the reserves are larger than anything recorded in the history of the world, and that he'd stake his reputation on every word because he doesn't know how to do otherwise. Menzies reads it, and Menzies, being no fool, immediately does the math and arrives at fury. 15%, he says, very slowly, when they get to the terms. You find the largest gold deposit in human history under my colony, and you offer me 15%. That is not an offer. That is an insult with a ribbon on it. And this is where Hamilton earns his passage. He doesn't argue the number. He steps to the window and points east, at 800 miles of nothing between Perth and the rest of the country. Sir John, without us, that gold is not a fortune. It's rocks. Rocks in the ground, 800 miles from a single port that can ship them, in a colony with no railway, no capital, and no navy to guard the coast when the world finds out what you're sitting on. He lets it breathe. But the fund doesn't just take. Sign, and inside 3 years there is a railway from Perth to Kalgoorlie. Inside 5, a line across the whole continent, and Perth stops being the edge of the world and becomes its western gate. He turns from the window. The wheels of history have started to turn, Sir John. You can leap onto the chariot, or you can be ground under it. But the wheels do not stop for a man standing still in the desert. Menzies doesn't answer. Menzies gets up and walks to his own window and stands there, and Cook tells me later that the Premier of Western Australia stood at that window all night and did not sleep, and that when the sun came up he was still standing there, looking east, at a future that had just arrived at his door, whether he liked it or not. While Menzies decides whether to join the future or fight it, I send men out to draw its spine. The line has to be surveyed before it can be built, and to survey a railway across an entire continent, you need someone who thinks the impossible is just a scheduling problem. I find him in a local inventor and aviation dreamer named George Stephenson, and I send him east to west with 30 men to walk the route the railway will one day take, up over the Blue Mountains, out across the plains, and into the Nullarbor, which is a Latin phrase that translates roughly to no trees and also no anything else. Young Sam, the greenest man on the survey team, asks the question every sane person asks. Why not just follow the coast? Flat, water, easy. Stevenson doesn't even look up from his transit. Because we're not drawing a line on a map, son. We're carving the keel of a nation. A keel doesn't hug the shore. It runs down the middle and holds everything else together. And they carve it, through country that measures them right back. When the route crosses ground the Aboriginal peoples hold sacred, Stevenson moves the line around it rather than through it, and trades salt and iron for safe passage and good water, and writes one line in his survey journal that I keep a copy of to this day. We came out here thinking we would measure the land. The land measures us. A month after that sleepless night at the window, a telegram reaches me in Sydney. Menzies is in. I've barely got time to enjoy it before I find out the future has enemies, and unlike Menzies, these ones aren't planning to join it. His name is Richard Cavendish, and he owns the old Australia, the one I'm quietly dismantling. Wool and ships and 40 years of the kind of money that doesn't shout because it's never had to. He runs the Australian Club, which is where the real decisions in this country have always been made, over brandy, by men who inherited the tables they're sitting at. And Cavendish has been watching this foreign prince arrive and start pulling gold out of the West and stringing railways across his continent, and talking about a currency that isn't the pound, and he has decided, in the calm way that dangerous men decide things, that I am a problem to be removed. His first move is a knife, and it's a clever one. He doesn't attack me, he praises me. He plants a man at the Sydney Morning Herald under the byline Senior Economic Observer, and that man writes long, worried, reasonable columns about the young governor's dangerous ambitions. Is it wise? Is it too fast? Can the colonies really afford this prince's dreams? Concern. Doubt, dressed as wisdom. The most poisonous thing you can pour into a nervous public, and Cavendish owns the cup it's served in. I read the first 3 columns over breakfast, and I don't get angry, because getting angry at a newspaper is like getting angry at the weather. I get practical. He owns the loudest voice in the country, I tell Thornton, folding the paper, so I'm not going to argue with his voice. I'm going to buy a louder one. I need my own paper. And I need it before Cavendish's whisper campaign convinces this nervous young country that its own future is a mistake. Setting up a newspaper turns out to be the most fun I've had since I got here, mostly because of who I hire to run it. Barton points me at a man named John Davies, a firebrand editor from the Melbourne Age with ink in his blood and a permanent grudge against anyone who tells him to soften a headline. I rent a warehouse down in the docks, fill it with rotary presses, and when Davies asks what kind of paper I want, I give him the only instruction that matters. I don't want a chronicler, I tell him. I don't want a paper that reports history after it's safely over. I want a co-author. I want a paper that helps write the thing while it's still being decided. Davies grins like a man who's been waiting his whole career for someone to say exactly that. February 1891. The first edition of the Australian Herald hits the streets, priced at half of what Cavendish's Herald charges, with a front-page editorial under my own name, written at the dawn of a new nation. It sells out before noon. They're reading it on trams and in pubs and on the steps of the very clubs where men are trying to strangle the thing it's celebrating. The second day, Davies runs the headline that turns a newspaper into a weapon. 4 words across the top of the page aimed straight at the frightened whispers of the Australian Club. Who's afraid of a strong Australia? It goes off like a bomb, because it does the one thing Cavendish's careful concern can't survive. It names the fear out loud and dares the country to be braver than it. Overnight, the argument stops being, is the prince too ambitious, and becomes, are we cowards or aren't we? And that is not a question a nervous public wants answered no. Cavendish has the old money and the old club and the old paper. I've got gold, a railway, and now a printing press that isn't afraid of him. And down in a lab by the harbor, I've got a wizard who's about to hand me something none of them will see coming for years. Sokolov's laboratory looks less like a workshop and more like the inside of a storm that agreed to hold still for visitors. He's built a scale model of a continent-spanning power network across 3 long tables, and he talks about it the way other men talk about a woman they love. You keep calling it a grid, he tells me, walking me through the copper and glass. It is not a grid. A grid is dead. This is a living organism. Power flows to where the body needs it and away from where it does not. It heals around damage. It breathes. Standing at the center of it is a tall coil he calls the Wardenclyffe model, and when he throws the switch, the whole room's hair stands up. Then he grins, which on Sokolov is a slightly alarming thing to witness, and he shows me the trick he's been saving. He hands me a glass lamp, just a bulb, no wire, nothing attached to it at all. Hold it up, he says. I hold it up. It lights in my hand, glowing soft and steady out of thin air, powered by nothing I can see. And I have spent a year in this century being unsurprised by things I already knew were coming, and I stand there holding a lamp lit by empty space with my mouth open like a farm boy at a fair. And then, because he's Sokolov, and one miracle is never enough, he sets a small model boat on a tank of water, walks to the far side of the room, and steers it. No string, no rod. He turns a dial and the little boat turns with it, obedient across the water to a hand it cannot possibly be connected to. Radio control. In 1891. Years before anyone on Earth is supposed to have it. Most men would run to the newspapers with this. I do the opposite. Doctor, I say, very quietly, this one we do not show anyone. Not the paper, not the convention, not London. This is not a party trick. This is the day we can talk to our ships when no one else can hear us, and the day we can send a torpedo to a target that never sees the man who fired it. I set the lamp down carefully. You just handed me the thing that wins the war nobody's declared yet. It goes in a vault. Sokolov, who has spent his whole life being told his miracles are worthless, looks at a man who just told him one is too dangerous to share. And I think it's the first time anyone's ever paid him a compliment he actually believes. So that's the vault taken care of. Now I have to do the thing that half my own government thinks will end my career. I have to go make peace with the people this country pretends aren't there. When I announce I'm going to sign a formal treaty with the Aboriginal peoples, my own officials react like I've announced I'm going to marry a shark. Treaty? With them? The words savages and impossible and think of London get used a great deal in that anxious, clipped way men use when they're frightened of an idea and calling it common sense. I don't argue with them in the office. I just go. No uniform, no guard. I walk out onto the grass above the harbor where the elders have agreed to meet, and I sit down on the ground with them, and I share the meal they're cooking, which is kangaroo, and it's good. And when the talk starts, I don't lecture. I ask about the rainbow serpent, and I know enough of the stories to ask the right questions, and I watch a wall come down in a set of very old, very careful eyes that have spent a lifetime being talked at by men in collars. Then we get to the actual treaty, and I make it real, because a promise that costs you nothing isn't worth the breath. Recognition of their lands. Reserves with genuine self-government, not the fiction of it. Where the railway has to cross their country, the Federation buys the right-of-way and pays for it every year in cattle and cloth and salt. Schools that teach in both languages, hospitals, a standing committee for Aboriginal affairs with a real chair at the table. It is not everything. I know the century that's coming, and I know how far this is from everything. But it is a start that no one else on this continent was willing to make. The eldest of them doesn't make a speech. He looks at me a long time, and then he reaches out and takes my hand and holds it, and we sign the thing not with pens, but with the flat of our painted palms pressed to the page, black handprints and mine among them, and I think it's the most honest signature I'll ever put on anything. My officials are horrified. London will be worse, and I do not care even slightly, because a nation that starts by pretending a whole people isn't standing on its own ground has already told its first lie, and I refuse to build on a lie. Now, with a treaty behind me and a paper in front of me, it's time for the fight I actually came here for. 52 men in a room, and a country to be argued into existence. The Constitutional Convention opens in Sydney in March 1891, and it is exactly the beautiful disaster I expected. 52 delegates from 6 colonies, and every one of them has ridden in with a list of things his colony will absolutely never surrender. I open with the speech I've been writing in my head since London, that our descendants will read every word we set down in this room, that we are not passing a budget, we are writing the sentence the future will begin with. It lands well. Applause, warm feeling. And then they get down to business, and it all falls apart within a day, exactly on the fault line I knew it would. The small colonies terrified of being swallowed by the big ones refusing to be shackled to the small ones, and everyone pretending it's about principle when it's about fear. So I stop trying to win it from the podium, and I go to work in the corridors, which is where every real constitution has ever actually been written. To the frightened small colonies, I don't give reassurance. I give them Clark and a briefing. He lays out, colony by colony, exactly what Germany and France and Japan are doing in the Pacific. The ships, the coaling stations, the appetite. And he lets them understand in their own stomachs that alone, each of them, is a morsel. And only together are they a country too big to swallow. Fear of each other meet fear of the actual world. To Barton, I give a harder job. You're the one man here everyone still trusts, I tell him. I need you to sell the compromise as your own. Because if it's mine, it's a prince's decree, and if it's yours, it's a nation's choice. And Barton, who is a genuinely great man and knows it, takes the weight. The deal we grind out over those weeks is clean, and it holds. The Federation gets defense, finance, customs, and the currency, the sinews, the things that only work as one. The states keep education and health and the daily texture of their people's lives. Nobody gets swallowed. Nobody gets to hide. And when I read the final draft, I feel a strange thing, because I know the Constitution this country got in the history I came from, and this one, hammered out in corridors by frightened men I bullied and flattered and frightened into greatness, this one is stronger. 52 men walked into that room as New South Welshmen and Victorians and Queenslanders. They're going to walk out as something that doesn't have a name yet. And the moment the ink is dry on the framework, I stop talking and start digging, because a constitution is just a promise, and I've got a continent full of promises to make good on before anyone loses their nerve. The Royal Mining Company gets registered, machinery and hundreds of miners sail for Western Australia, and Menzies and I drive the first spike of the Fremantle to Kalgoorlie Railway ourselves, both of us swinging the hammer like we've got something to prove, which we do. And immediately, it nearly blows up in my face, because gold does to people exactly what I knew it would. Word gets out, and a speculative fever grabs the whole country by the throat. The Kalgoorlie concept, they're calling it. And men are mortgaging farms to buy shares in claims that are nothing but a name and a dream. It's a bubble, and I've seen where bubbles end. And if it bursts on its own, it'll take the real economy down with it, and hand Cavendish the crash he's praying for. Everyone expects me to pump it. It's my gold, my company, my boom. I do the opposite. I take out the loudest pages of my own newspaper and I publish everything, every survey number, every honest projection. And I put Cook, the geologist who doesn't know how to lie, in front of the whole country to say, plainly, there is a great deal of gold here. There will not be a fortune overnight. Anyone promising you one is selling you air. The bubble hisses and goes flat. Not with a crash, with the quiet disappointment of gamblers realizing the game is honest. And the money that would have burned in speculation flows instead into the real thing: the railway, the port, the mills. Thornton watches it happen and shakes his head slowly. Most men in your position, he says, would have gotten rich on that madness. You just gave it away. He looks almost offended, and then almost worshipful. You didn't just build a company. You built the rules. You showed this entire nation what an honest market looks like, using your own fortune as the demonstration. The rules are the only thing worth building, I tell him. Anyone can dig a hole and get gold out. I want a country where the man who finds the gold doesn't have to whip anyone to keep it. Gold's flowing. Rails are going down. Which means it's time for the thing that actually makes a nation dangerous instead of just rich. Steel. We pick Newcastle for the works, and we pick it for a reason that isn't in any account book. It's a blank slate, close to coal, close to iron, close to water, and unclaimed by any of the old money. Karl Richter, the German metallurgist I poached, walks the ground, crumbles the ore in his fist, and says the sentence that decides where this country's spine gets forged. The ore is excellent. Give me this, and I will make you steel to match anything in the world. The Australian Steel Company opens its books to public subscription. And right on schedule, Cavendish's Sydney Morning Herald howls that it's uneconomic, reckless, doomed, a rich boy's toy. So I answer them the way I've learned works best in this country, which is not with a rebuttal, but with a picture. Davies runs a cartoon across the front page, the Australian people as a flock of sheep, and the caption underneath asks the only question that matters. Are we the shearers, or the sheep being sheared? The public reads it, looks at 40 years of being fleeced by the old money, and buys steel shares until the subscription overflows. Rich is good. Rich with your own steel is better. But a wealthy country with no teeth is just a well-set table waiting for a hungry guest, and I have read enough history to know the guests are coming. Clark puts the report on my desk, and it's grim. 6 colonial armies that are really 6 clubs with rifles a decade out of date and artillery you load from the front like it's the Napoleonic Wars. It's not a defense force, it's a dare. So we build a real one, and we start it the way you start everything that has to last, with the young. We found a military academy at Duntroon on the Yass River, and out of more than 1,000 applicants we take 100 cadets, and here's the part that matters. We take them from every colony, and we mix them until the colony stops meaning anything. There's a moment early on during an endurance march that I hear about later and never forget. A boy from Western Australia, near the end of himself, comes across a Victorian cadet who's collapsed and can't go on. A boy from the colony his own colony has been taught to resent his whole life. And the West Australian doesn't step over him. He picks him up and carries him, and the two of them cross the finish line together. And something in the whole class breaks open when they do. That's the moment the barriers come down. Not in a treaty room, on a dirt track, one exhausted boy carrying another. They're not Victorians and West Australians anymore, Clark says, watching them come in. He sounds like a man seeing something he waited his whole career for. They're Australian soldiers. I've got gold, steel, a paper, a constitution, and the first 100 young men who think of themselves as one country instead of 6. Which is right about when the sky decides to test whether any of it can survive a bad season. The drought of 1892 arrives the way real disasters do, not all at once, but as a slow closing of the throat. The Murray drops to a trickle. The paddocks go from gold to gray to bone. Sheep and cattle die in numbers that break the men who owned them, and the Sydney Morning Herald, never one to miss a chance, runs the drought as the judgment of God on a country that dared to reach above its station. A prince builds railways to nowhere and steel mills against nature, and see how the Almighty answers. Divine punishment makes a great headline. It makes a terrible policy. So I go to the dying country myself, with William Ferrer, the wheat man, and I look at the cracked ground with the eyes of someone who knows this is going to happen again and worse, and I make 2 plans, one for the wound, one for the disease. The wound first, because people are hungry now. Ferrer has been quietly breeding a wheat he calls Punjab No. 1, a tough, dry country strain that yields where the old English wheat curls up and dies. I give the seed away, free, to every farmer who'll plant it, with cheap federal loans behind it, and I send Ferrer's men out to teach dry farming to people whose fathers farmed this land like it was Kent. The disease is thirst itself, and for that, I put a monster on the drawing board, a scheme to divert water clear across the Great Dividing Range, banking the wet side rain and carrying it west to the country that's starving for it. It's the kind of project that takes a generation. That's fine. I'm planning to be here for a generation. Then the sky, having made its point, relents. The rain comes back. And it comes back onto fields planted with Farrer's new wheat. And the harvest that follows isn't just a recovery, it's a record, the best this country has ever pulled out of its own dirt. The farmers who prayed for divine mercy got something better, a seed and a plan and a government that showed up in the dust instead of writing sermons about it. The Herald quietly stops running the Wrath of God columns. Hard to sell divine punishment to a man with a full barn. I've barely got the wheat in when I'm reminded that the most dangerous weather in my life doesn't come from the sky. It comes from London, sealed in wax. The letter is from my grandmother, and under the affection, it's a warning. London is nervous. The whispers have made the crossing. A national experiment, a treaty with the natives, a central bank that isn't the Bank of England. Words like disloyal are being said in rooms that matter, and they're sending a man to look at me. Sir Reginald Croft of the Colonial Office. An inspector, a leash dressed as a courtesy. Thornton wants to prepare a defense, dossiers, justifications, a careful case for every controversial thing we've done. I stop him. We're not going to defend anything, I tell him. A man who defends himself has already agreed he's on trial. When Croft gets here, we're not going to explain Australia to him. I look out at the harbor, at the cranes and the smoke and the ships. We're going to let Australia explain itself. We're not defending, we're demonstrating. Which is a lovely plan, right up until the morning the demonstration gets interrupted by 5 German warships sailing into my harbor without so much as a telegram. I'm at breakfast when the runner comes, white-faced, and says there are 5 men of war of the Imperial German Navy standing into Sydney Harbor under Admiral von Diedrichs, unannounced, uninvited, guns visible, and the city is starting to panic. And here's the thing, Sydney can't stop them. Not really. Our coastal batteries are half a rumor. If von Diedrichs wanted to embarrass us, he could sit in our harbor and there is very little we could do but watch. The whole town knows it. You can feel the fear going up like a tide. So the first thing I do is decide what this actually is. This isn't war, I tell Clark, who's already halfway to sounding every alarm we have. If it were war, we'd be finding out from the wreckage, not the harbor master. This is a demonstration. He's come to look at the frightened little colony everyone's talking about and watch it wet itself. I straighten my jacket. So we are going to be the one thing he did not sail 8,000 miles to see. We are going to be completely, insultingly calm. And we play it exactly like that. The batteries we do have quietly train their guns, loaded, ranged, but not a single alarm bell rung, no scramble, no panic in the streets that a telescope could catch. A harbor pilot goes out to the German flagship by the ordinary peacetime protocol, as if 5 foreign battleships turn up for tea every Tuesday. And that same evening, instead of cowering behind our thin defenses, I throw them a banquet. I meet von Diedrichs in my own German, decent German, with a Bavarian accent that visibly startles him, and I talk Goethe with him, and Beethoven, and I serve wild boar because I've done my reading on what a Prussian admiral misses at sea. And at the height of it, on my signal, Sokolov lights the word Willkommen across the front of the residence in electric fire, wirelessly, no candle, no gas, letters of pure light hanging in the Sydney night, and I watch a hardened German admiral forget for 1 full second to be intimidating. Then, as he's leaving, I give him the parting gift. Warm, smiling, absolutely lethal. It has been an honor, Admiral. Do come again in a few years. I let the smile widen. By then, our own yards at Newcastle will be building cruisers, and I flatter myself they'll be a fair match for the Irene. Von Diedrichs writes in his logbook that night, I have this on good authority, years later, a single assessment that I frame in my memory forever. Sydney is defenseless, but its master is dangerous. He sails away having proved his point. We couldn't stop him. And he sails away having handed me a gift worth more than any battery. Because the whole country watched 5 foreign warships sit unchallenged in our own front garden. And the whole country arrived, overnight and all at once, at the same furious conclusion. We are building a navy. Now nobody has to be talked into it. And into that freshly terrified, freshly united country, the very next week, walks Sir Reginald Croft of the Colonial Office, with his leash and his questionnaire, expecting to inspect a wayward colony. I don't let him inspect anything. I show him things. I take him to Duntroon, and he watches 100 cadets from 6 colonies drill as one unit and mutters, almost to himself, that it reminds him of Sandhurst. I feed him bread baked from Farrer's drought-proof wheat and let him taste a solved problem. I walk him past the Committee for Aboriginal Affairs doing actual work. He came looking for chaos and treason and finds, everywhere he turns, a machine that runs better than the ones back home. And then, for the finale, I give him the City of Light. I've had Sokolov wire the whole Central District for a single night. I get Croft up on a balcony over the crowd, and at the appointed moment, I pull one lever, and hundreds of electric lamps ignite at once across a city that until this second was lit by gas and moonlight. The crowd below goes dead silent, that held breath a crowd takes when it sees something its grandparents wouldn't have believed, and then it roars. And on the face of the residents, in letters of light you could read from a ship at sea, one word burns against the dark: Australia. Croft stands there with the electric light on his face, and I watch the leash go slack in his hand. The report he sends to London is not the report he was sent to write. It calls Australia a beacon of the empire in the Pacific. The inspector came to measure a problem and left as a witness for the defense. I've turned an inquisitor into an advertisement. But somewhere across town, in a leather chair at the Australian Club, a cornered old man is watching me win. And cornered men are the most dangerous kind, because they stop trying to beat you fairly and start trying to end you. Cavendish has stopped whispering. Now he's doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic is about how to break a man who's borrowed to build fast. Because that's my one real weakness, and he's found it. Everything I've built, the railway, the steel, the bank, the university, runs on a chain of credit. Money owed here to pay for work there, the way every young nation in history has grown, on borrowed time and faith. Cut that chain in the right link, and the whole thing doesn't slow down. It falls. I hear about the plan the way you hear about these things, in pieces, from men who owe me more than they owe him. He's writing to London, coded letters, sailing out on the mail steamers, to old banking friends in the city. Spread the word that the colonial experiment is overheating. Get the big houses nervous. Get them to pull their money home all at once. Trigger a run. 7 wounds, he tells his banker Walter Raleigh, and Raleigh writes it down. 7 wounds to him, and I'll take a few to myself gladly, so long as he bleeds out first. He's willing to hurt his own fortune to kill mine. That's the thing I file away and don't forget. This isn't greed anymore, it's hate, and hate does its sums differently. And while he's mailing his poison across the ocean, I do the thing that must look, to him, like the most reckless possible use of my time. I go and found a university. The Royal University of Technology isn't a vanity project, though every account book in the country screams that it is. It's the long game, the one Cavendish can't see because he thinks in wool and I think in decades. 6 colleges, and among them one nobody in this hemisphere has ever built before. A college of social sciences, with Thornton himself as dean, because I want this country to produce men who understand how money and power actually move, not just men who can dig. The campus goes in the new capital to be. Admission is open, every class, and both sexes, which scandalizes exactly the people I want scandalized, with scholarships for the poor. I put £100,000 of my own money into it, publicly, so no one can pretend it's the taxpayer's folly. And I stock it with the same kind of people I built my crew from, the brilliant and the unwanted. Lord Kelvin lends his name. Siemens, the crippled electrical genius the American firms use up and overlook. German chemists who'd rather build than serve the Kaiser. I'm not just buying professors, I'm buying the next 30 years of every clever mind that Europe and America are too proud or too frightened to use. Cavendish is mailing letters to break my present. I'm building the thing that owns my future. But the present is where you can bleed, and Cavendish knows it, and he opens his real campaign not with the banks, but with the one thing that can turn a whole country against its own government overnight. He starts a strike. Cavendish owns the great wool sheds, and he tears up the agreement with the shearers' union and slashes their rates, and he does it knowing exactly what will happen. Tens of thousands of shearers throw down their blades. The wool clip, this country's oldest source of wealth, stops. and within days there are bloody clashes on the roads and outside the sheds, men against men, and it is spreading like a grass fire in the very drought country that just learned to fear fire. And it's a trap, a genuinely good one, and I see the jaws of it the moment it closes. If I send force to break the strike and restart the wool, I'm a tyrant crushing my own working people, and every union man who cheered me becomes an enemy. If I back the shearers against the great landowners, then London gets its telegram at last. The prince isn't governing a colony, he's leading a rebellion against property and order. Crush the workers or become the villain of the empire. Cavendish has built a machine where both levers electrocute me, so I don't pull either one. I do the thing he didn't leave a lever for. First, the blood has to stop, because dead men make martyrs, and martyrs make revolutions. I send the Duntroon cadets, but not to break the strike. I send them to stand between the two sides, not to crush anyone. To separate them, to put a disciplined, unarmed in anger wall of young men from every colony in between the shearers and the landlord's bully boys, so that nobody else dies while the grown-ups talk. It's a fine distinction, and it holds, barely, because the cadets are too obviously not there to kill anyone. Then I build a table. A Royal Arbitration Commission, Thornton in the chair, both sides forced to sit at it. And to Cavendish, privately, I send a single message that turns his own arithmetic against him. Every wool contract his sheds hold with the Federation is about to come up for review, and the new railway branch his estates have been counting on can very easily be surveyed to run somewhere else. He wanted to make me choose between two disasters. I've just shown him his fortune sitting on my table, next to the knife. Cavendish goes pale when he gets that message, but pale isn't beaten. And the arbitration table, it turns out, is where I learned that some fires you can't put out with money, because the men on the other side of it aren't fighting about wages at all. The negotiations start, and they go nowhere loudly. On one side, Cavendish's lawyer, a smooth, cold article named Fitzwilliam, arguing the price of wool and the rights of property. On the other, a red-haired Irishman named Liam O'Malley, a shearer with forearms like ship's cable and a voice that fills a room. And O'Malley isn't there to split the difference. We're not asking for charity, he says, slamming a hand on the table. We are not the rabble your papers call us. We are the labor of this country, the men whose backs your wool rides on, and we will not be sheared like the sheep. Thornton, brilliant, rational Thornton, who can model any market on Earth, leans over to me during a recess and admits he's out of his depth. And it's the first time I've ever seen it. It's not numbers, Your Highness, he says quietly. I keep offering them arithmetic, and they keep answering with dignity. This isn't a negotiation, it's a class war, and I don't have an equation for a wound that old. He's right. You can't compromise your way out of a fight where one side has been talked down to for 100 years, and the other doesn't understand why the first side is still angry after such a generous offer. I'm not going to win this at the table. Then we don't solve it at the table, I tell Thornton. We change what the table weighs. Add a weight to the scale nobody's looking at, and we'll settle the whole thing underneath it, without a single side having to say they lost. And the weight I've got in mind isn't a wage or a law. It's a job, 3,000 of them, and it's about to make the most powerful landowners in Australia panic in a way no shearer ever could. Here's the move. While the arbitration grinds on and Cavendish waits for the strikers to get hungry enough to crawl back, I announce that the Federation is hiring. The railway and the mines need 3,000 men right now at 5 shillings a day, twice what a dock worker makes, with housing thrown in. Watch what that does. The striking shearers, who've been holding out on empty stomachs waiting for Cavendish to blink, suddenly have somewhere else to go, somewhere better. They don't crawl back to the sheds at reduced rates. They walk, in their thousands, off to lay rail and dig ore for a wage that makes the old shearing money look like an insult. The strike doesn't get crushed. It empties out from the bottom, one well-paid man at a time. And now it's the landowners who can't sleep. Because it's shearing season, the wool is heavy on the sheep's backs, and there is nobody left to take it off. Their whole fortune is standing in the paddocks, growing more valuable and more useless by the day. And the men who could harvest it are all off building my country instead. O'Malley works it out first, and I watch the understanding cross his face at the table, the anger draining out and something like awe replacing it. That's not a job offer, he says slowly. That's a transfusion. You're bleeding the strike out through a better vein, and you're doing it by paying my men more, so I can't even be angry about it. Cavendish works it out too, about a day later, and his response is less philosophical. He smashes a teacup, gets in his carriage, and races to the residence to confront me in person, where my secretary informs him, with beautiful regret, that the Governor-General is in Newcastle and won't be back for a week. He stands in my empty hall holding his hat while my country hires his workforce out from under him. The balance of the whole negotiation flips overnight, and I'd love to tell you that's when Cavendish folded. But Cavendish had one card left, and it was the big one, the one he'd mailed to London months ago, and it shows this exact moment to arrive. The blow lands from 8,000 miles away, and it lands hard. Baring Brothers, one of the great London banks, calls in £5 million of Australian debt to be repaid in a month. It's Cavendish's poison letters finally doing their work. He's spooked the city, and now the city wants its money home before the colonial house of cards folds. And of course, the Sydney Morning Herald has the story before the ink on the demand is dry. London has lost faith. The prince has overreached. The bill has come due. That headline is a match, and the country is dry tinder. The stock exchange drops like a shot bird, and then the thing every young economy fears in its bones begins, a run on the banks. Ordinary people, frightened by the headline, line up in the rain to pull their savings out before the crash they've just been promised. Cavendish, I'm told, opens champagne. He can see it now, the chain snapping, link by link, exactly where he aimed. I spend that night alone in my office, and I won't pretend my hands were steady, because this is the closest he ever gets. 1 month to find £5 million, a public losing its nerve, a press owned by my enemy narrating my funeral. If the run outpaces me, everything, the railway, the steel, the treaty, the whole nation I've been welding together, comes apart in 30 days, and the men who called it kangaroos and convicts get to be right. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, I stop being afraid because I finally see it. Cavendish has attacked me with fear. Fear is a story, and I own the one thing on this continent that can tell a louder story than a bank run. I own the gold. 2 orders go out before dawn. The first to Kalgoorlie. Load the bullion, all of it, everything we've dug, and bring it to Sydney under guard, and do it in 1 week. The second to Thornton. The Royal Bank of Australia was going to open in 3 months. It opens in 3 days. Cavendish thinks he's snapped my credit chain. He's about to find out I was never really running on credit. I was running on 5 tons of gold in the red dirt of Western Australia, and I'm about to stack it where every frightened person in this country can see it. The Royal Bank of Australia opens in the old General Post Office building, and I open it the way you're not supposed to open a bank in the middle of a panic. Publicly, theatrically, with the doors thrown wide. The gold comes in the night before under a convoy that looks like it's guarding the crown jewels, because it more or less is. Duntroon cadets with live rounds, wagons under the royal seal, 50 crates of it hauled up the post office steps. And the next morning, with a crowd packed into the street and every reporter in the country watching, I don't make a speech about confidence. Speeches about confidence are what men make when they don't have any. Instead, I have the vault opened, all the way, in front of everyone. 50 crates, more than 5 tons of raw gold, still red with the dust of Kalgoorlie, gleaming dull and impossible under the electric lights. There's a moment of pure silence. Then a reporter down in front, I'll never forget this, reaches out and actually touches it, presses his fingers to a bar like he needs his skin to believe what his eyes are telling him, and he turns to the crowd with his voice cracking and shouts, "It's real! It's actually real! We've got our own gold!" And the run reverses in an afternoon. The same lines of frightened people that were pulling money out of the private banks turn around and march to the post office to put it into a bank that has 5 tons of proof sitting behind glass. We start selling federal sovereign bonds, kangaroo and eucalyptus stamped on the paper instead of a London crest, and they sell as fast as we can print them. In 1 day, the fear Cavendish mailed across an ocean runs into a wall of gold and dies there. Baring wanted its 5 million. It gets its 5 million, on the day it asked, in Australian gold, with a polite note. The firewall against London is built, and it's built out of the one thing they were sure a nation of convicts and kangaroos didn't have. But settling a panic isn't the same as winning the war, and I don't want Cavendish beaten. I want the country that beat him to feel like it did it together. So for the next move, I don't go to a bank at all. I go to a steel mill, and I bring the Union with me. The first blast furnace at Newcastle is ready to be lit, and lighting a blast furnace is a real thing. You tap the fire in, and the whole beast comes alive and pours molten iron for the first time, and it only happens once. I could light it as the Governor-General, Prince and Patron, the great man's triumph. Instead, I show up in a workman's rough coat, and I get up in front of the men who built the thing, and I tell them the truth. This furnace doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to the company. It belongs to you, every man who laid a brick of it. And then I do the thing that ends the class war more completely than any arbitration table ever could. I call Liam O'Malley up out of the crowd. Liam O'Malley, the red-haired Union firebrand who was screaming across a table at me a month ago, and I put the tapping bar in his hands beside mine, and the prince and the labor leader light the first fire of Australian steel together, shoulder to shoulder, in front of the whole workforce. The flame roars up and paints half the sky orange, and the men lose their minds. And somewhere in that crowd, Richard Cavendish is watching a prince and a striker light a furnace together, and I'm told that's the first moment the old man ever felt genuine fear. Not of losing money, of losing the country. Because the Australia he owned, the one run from leather chairs over brandy, where labor knew its place and wealth kept its distance, that Australia just died in a shower of sparks. And a different one got born, and he wasn't invited to either. With the furnace lit and the strike bled dry, the arbitration finishes almost as an afterthought, and what comes out of it is bigger than a wage settlement. The labor capital contract of 1892, legal unions, a minimum wage, the 8-hour day, and a federal industrial arbitration court with the power to freeze both strikes and lockouts while it hears a dispute. Davies puts it best in the Herald. We just talked our way out of a civil war. Other nations pay for this in blood. We paid for it in argument. And then, because I apparently can't leave a triumph alone, I pick a fight nobody asked me to pick, over a coin. The new Australian pound needs a design, and everyone assumes the Queen goes on it because the Queen goes on everything. I put someone else on it too. On the face of the coin, beside a pioneer in profile, I place an Aboriginal man, the two of them side by side, equal, looking the same direction. The officials nearly faint. The Sydney Morning Herald calls it a betrayal of Anglo-Saxon blood, an insult to the race that built the colony. And I answer it not with an apology, but with an essay in my own paper, under my own name. One coin, one nation, two souls. Because I don't want this country to sleepwalk into being a small, cold copy of England at the bottom of the world. I want it to look at what it actually is, a place with a double inheritance, older than the empire and younger than the century, and decide, out loud, to be honest about it. It sets off a national argument about who we are that runs for months in every pub and parlor and letters page in the country, which is exactly what I wanted. A nation that's arguing about its own soul is a nation that's decided it has one. For about 3 weeks in the spring of 1893, the machine runs without me having to push it. And I do something I haven't done since London. I stop. Kalgoorlie is pumping gold. The railway's crawling east and west toward the middle. The second furnace is lit. The first Duntroon class is nearly ready. For once, nothing is on fire, and I ride out alone to the empty hills where the capital is going to stand. Right now, it's just grass and surveyor's stakes, little wooden pegs marked RUT where the university will be, a city that exists only in my head and on Burnham's drawings. I sit down on the hill as the sun goes and the stars come up, and out here, away from the gaslight, they come up the way they don't in London, thick and close and wheeling, and the Southern Cross hangs over the exact spot where I'm going to put a parliament. And I let myself feel it, just for a minute, the thing I don't say out loud in cabinet rooms. When I woke up in this century, I was a stranger wearing a dead prince's face, a man from a future nobody would believe, homesick for a world that hadn't happened yet. And somewhere in the last 3 years, between the gold and the steel and the handprints on the treaty and Liam O'Malley's fist on that tapping bar, this stopped being a project I was running and started being a place I was from. This land is my home, I say, out loud, to nobody, under a sky with no borders on it. My grandfather's meteorite is in my pocket, the iron that fell from a place with no borders either, and I hold it for a while and don't say anything else. Then I get up, because the man from the future has a great deal of future to build, and I ride back down the hill toward toward the lights. The next miracle comes over a wire, and then over no wire at all. Sokolov sends for me, buzzing like the coil he lives next to, and shows me his latest KA, a wireless telegraph that throws a clean signal 200 miles, from the capital site clear out to Duntroon, dots and dashes flying through empty air. That alone would be the wonder of the age, but Sokolov is never satisfied with the wonder of the age. He wants the age after it. He sits me down in front of a receiver, throws a switch, and out of the brass horn, scratchy, thin, but unmistakably human, comes a voice. A man's voice, reciting, of all things, to be or not to be. No wire runs to the horn. The voice is simply in the air, and Sokolov has reached out and pulled it down. The first human voice ever broadcast, in a shed in Australia, years before the rest of the world manages it. Clark, who I've brought along, actually takes a step back. "Your Highness," he says, and he's not entirely joking, "is this witchcraft?" "No," I tell him, watching the horn like it might do it again. "It's better than witchcraft. Witchcraft only works for the witch." Because I can already see what this is. Not a telegraph. A voice that can reach every kitchen and pub and shearing shed in the country at the same instant. A thing that can make 10,000 scattered strangers feel, in the same second, like one people. I set up the Federal Broadcasting and Radio Administration before I even leave the building. The railway is the nation's bones, and the grid is its blood. This is going to be its voice, and one day I'm going to use it to talk to a whole country at once, and it's going to save me. But first, the country needs men to defend it, and the first 100 are ready. The Duntroon graduation isn't like any military ceremony you've seen. 100 young lieutenants from every corner of the continent, and when they take their oath, it isn't to a colony or even to the crown. It's to Australia, the word said plainly, as a thing that exists now, worth dying for. They raise their sabers to a clear sky, and there's no applause, because I've asked for none. Some things are too heavy to clap for. One of them stands out, a serious, quiet boy from Western Australia named John Chifley, the one who carried the collapsed Victorian across the finish line 2 years ago. He's the symbol of the whole thing now, the first of a generation that thinks of the continent as one country, because they were never taught to think anything else. Clark watches them march off and says the thing that starts my next war. "It's a fine army, Your Highness, but an army guards a fortress, and our fortress has no wall on the seaward side. The Germans proved it in our own harbor." He looks out toward the heads. "We need a fleet, 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, or all of this sits behind an open door." He's right, and getting a fleet turns out to be a fight on 2 fronts, one in my own parliament and one with the empire itself. The Navy Act of 1894 asks the Parliament for £10 million, and the Parliament nearly comes apart at the seams over it. 10 million for ships, when we've farms wanting water and rails wanting steel. And it's a fair objection, right up until Barton stands and asks the only question that matters, in the voice of a man who was there. When 5 German battleships stood in Sydney Harbor with their guns run out, where was the Royal Navy? How many days away? How many of your children's lives away? The bill passes. And then comes the second front, and it teaches me a lesson I never forget. I go to the London Admiralty to buy the ships, cash in hand, ready to be a good, loyal customer, and they offer to sell me their cast-offs. They're old, obsolete cruisers, the ones the Dreadnought is about to make worthless, and they offer them at a 30% markup, as though they're doing me a favor by letting the colonials play sailor with the fleet's hand-me-downs. I decline, very politely, and I file the lesson away where I keep the important ones. You cannot buy the core of your own strength. They will sell you their yesterday at a premium and keep their tomorrow for themselves, always, because that's what an empire is. If I want ships that can actually win the war that's coming, I'm going to have to build them myself, which means I need the one thing London will never sell at any price. I need the men who know how to build the future, and I know exactly where the world is throwing those men away. Germany is full of brilliant men its own establishment can't stomach, and the most brilliant of the ones I want is a submarine engineer named Helmut von Richthofen. He's from Bloom and Voss, a genius by every account, and the German Navy won't listen to him because he believes the future of naval war isn't the great battleship at all, it's the boat that hunts from under the water, unseen. The Junkers think he's a crank. I think he's a prophet with a grudge, which is my favorite kind of hire. Getting him out is a small spy novel. Richter makes the first contact. Von Richthofen travels under the name Master Carpenter down through Singapore onto a coal ship, arriving at Newcastle looking like a nervous clerk and carrying the plans for weapons that don't exist yet in his head. When he sees the Newcastle yards, the steel, the freedom, the blank page, he says the thing that tells me I've got another one for life. For 20 years I have had these dreams and nowhere to build them. I have finally found a stage large enough for all my madness. That's 4 continents worth of exiles now, all pointed at the same empty coast. And while they build the future in secret, I've got to build the place it's all going to be governed from. A capital, out of grass and stakes and an argument nobody wants to have. I throw the design of the capital open to the whole world, and 137 plans come in from every drawing board on the planet. The one that wins is from an American named Daniel Burnham, and it wins because it's the only one that isn't a monument. Everyone else drew a city about power, grand axes, triumphal avenues, a capital that stands on your neck. Burnham drew a city built around a lake, organic, growing with the land instead of stamping on it, a capital that says the nation belongs to the people who live in it, rather than the man who runs it. The bureaucrats hate it, naturally, and set about strangling it in committees, because that's what bureaucrats do to anything with a soul. So I do the unsubtle thing. I take over the building committee personally. I give Burnham the final word on his own city in writing, and I dare the paper shufflers to fight a prince. They don't. The ground breaks. Canberra starts becoming a real place. And then Queensland forces my hand on the ugliest thing in the country, the thing everyone's agreed not to look at. They call it blackbirding, and it's a soft word for a hard crime. Pacific Islanders, the Kanakas, taken from their homes by trick and by force, and worked on the Queensland sugar plantations in conditions that are slavery in everything but the paperwork. The unions want it banned outright. The planters and the Queensland Premier, Philp, want it kept, and they're threatening to secede from the whole federation rather than give up their cheap bound labor. I send a royal commission to look, and what it finds I make myself read every page of. The barracks, the scarred backs, the unmarked graves, a death rate 10 times what any free workforce would suffer. And I write across the front of that report the sentence that decides it. The sun of the Federation must reach every dark corner, without exception. But I've learned that you don't beat an entire regional economy with a moral speech and a ban, you'll just get your secession. So I do it the way I do everything, the stick wrapped in a very generous carrot. The trade is outlawed, the men already here are put on equal wages, and the Federation pays to repatriate any who want to go home. And in the same motion, so Queensland doesn't burn, a £5 million fund to mechanize the sugar industry so it doesn't need bound men, an institute for tropical agriculture, and new guaranteed markets in Canada and New Zealand. I take away their slaves and hand them a future that's worth more than the slaves were. Queensland grumbles, does the sums, and stays. It's not clean. Nothing about that corner of the country is clean. But the graves stop, and the men go home, and the Federation reaches the one place it had been letting itself not see. And then, to wash the taste of that out, I go and watch us lay down the thing that's going to make sure no one ever does to us what we're strong enough now to stop doing to others. The keel of the Sydney. It happens in a secret ceremony in a covered dock because I don't want London reading about it in the papers before it floats. She's a cruiser, 4,500 tons, an 8-inch armored belt, Krupp 210mm guns, and a design speed of 23 knots, which is to say faster and harder hitting than anything the Royal Navy would ever have sold us. When the first plate goes down, Clark, hard old soldier Clark, has tears on his face and doesn't bother to hide them. HMAS Sydney. Not bought, not begged, ours, from the keel up. She'll take 2 years to build, and in those 2 years, hundreds of Australian men who'd never seen a warship up close learn how to make one, which is worth more than the ship, because a ship is one hull, and a shipyard full of men who know how to build ships is a navy forever. I've got a navy being born in secret. Now I want to make sure the neighbor across the Pacific, the big friendly one with the growing fleet and the same nervous eye on Japan that I've got, knows we exist. So I invite the Americans. Davies is sending his great white fleet around the world to show the flag, and I write and ask him to bring it to Sydney. And I sweeten the invitation with a gift he can't refuse, Sokolov's charts of the Pacific currents, better than anything the US Navy has. Davies, who loves a bold gesture more than almost anyone alive, says yes. 16 white battleships come through the heads, and Sydney throws a week-long party. But the party isn't the point. The point happens behind a closed door, where I sit down with Admiral Dewey and we say the quiet thing out loud. We're both looking at the same thing across that ocean, I tell him. A rising power in the east that neither of us is ready to fight alone. He doesn't disagree. Australian ships get invited to Norfolk. A triangle forms in the Pacific: London, Washington, and Canberra. And for the first time, the little nation at the bottom of the world isn't a colony waiting for orders. It's a corner of something. The exiled boy who got laughed out of a London drawing room now has the American fleet in his harbor and a private understanding with the President of the United States. And with the guns taken care of, I go back to the thing that outlasts guns, the mines, and open the doors of the university I've been stocking with the world's cast-offs. The Royal University of Technology opens in Canberra, and it's the strangest faculty ever assembled. Siemens is there, the hunchbacked electrical genius the American firms wore out and discarded, and when I greet him, I shake his hand without a flicker of the pity he's spent his life being handed, because a man like that doesn't want your sympathy. He wants your respect and a laboratory. There are Jewish chemists from Berlin who came here as much for refuge as for the salary, and I make sure they know this coast doesn't care what god they pray to. And for chancellor, I don't pick a bureaucrat. I pick Stevenson, the railway surveyor and dreamer, because I tell the assembled scholars, I don't need an administrator to run this place. I need a soul. I give them one instruction in my opening address. Your tools here are equations, not axes. Other men built this country with picks and hammers. You will build the next one with mathematics. 300 students walk in the first day, rich and poor, men and women, and I look at them and see the engineers and physicists and estimates who'll run this place long after I'm gone. But building the future in the open means someone's always trying to steal it, and one rainy night, someone nearly does. A reporter from Cavendish's Sydney Morning Herald, a persistent little snoop named Smith Davies, climbs into the covered dry dock in the middle of a thunderstorm and sees the thing I've been hiding from the whole world. A German-designed cruiser taking shape where officially there is no such ship. He's got the scoop of the decade in his notebook. He'd have gotten clean away with it too, except a cat knocks a can off a shelf, he bolts, and the night watch spots him going over the wall. Clark wants him arrested on the spot. I tell him no. You arrest him, I say, and you've confirmed the story. A prince who jails a journalist has something to hide, and the something is exactly what he saw. I think about it for a moment, and then I start to smile, because there's a better move here than a cell. We don't bury his story, we bury it under a bigger one. He saw us building a warship in secret? Fine. Tomorrow we announce, with trumpets, that we were never hiding it at all. The next morning, the government proudly unveils the Ship Contribution Plan. Australia, loyal daughter of the Empire, is building a magnificent cruiser as a gift to the Royal Navy. A gift. Davies' expose detonates in his hands. You can't expose a secret the government just threw a parade about, and the public, thrilled at the patriotism of it, starts a subscription to help pay for the gift. London, however, is not fooled, and London sends its sharpest mind to find out what I'm really doing. They send Herbert Asquith. The Prime Minister's cousin, a future Prime Minister himself, one of the finest intellects the Empire has produced, and he arrives for an unofficial visit, which is diplomatic language for an interrogation with better wine. Our first conversation is a duel with the swords kept in their scabbards. One does wonder, Asquith muses, admiring a Newcastle-forged fitting, whether it was Sydney sunshine or Hamburg beer that inspired such fine engineering. He knows about the Germans. He's telling me he knows. Then he makes his offer, and it's elegant, the way everything about Asquith is elegant. Give the Royal Navy the cruiser, as promised, and in exchange, London will let Australia have 2 of its old Apollo-class cruisers. Take our yesterday, he's saying, and give us your tomorrow, and let's call it loyalty. The echo of the Empire, he calls it, this arrangement where the colonies build and the mother country commands. He is, without question, the most dangerous opponent I've faced, not because he's cruel, but because he's brilliant, and he genuinely believes the Empire should stay one mind, with the thinking done in London. And I can't out-argue him. Asquith has never lost an argument in his life, so I decide not to argue with him at all. I decide to let the continent argue for me, and the continent, right on cue, hands me a disaster to win him over with. The Transcontinental Railway has reached the Nullarbor, and the Nullarbor is trying to kill it. 5,000 men are out there, laying track across a limestone desert with no water and no mercy. The limestone is so hard it's shattering the drill bits faster than we can ship replacements. And worst of all, the water convoys, wagons hauling barrels across a month of nothing, can't keep 5,000 working men alive in that heat. The reports coming back are getting shorter and more frightening. Men are starting to go down. If I can't get water to that railhead in days, not weeks, the Great Line across the continent dies of thirst 300 miles from anywhere, and it takes a lot of good men with it. I lay the problem in front of the crew, and it's Sokolov, of course it's Sokolov, who looks at a water crisis in the middle of a desert and says the maddest possible sentence. So we will make the sea into drinking water, and we will bring the power plant to them. Everyone stares at him. He explains it like he's describing the weather. Electrodialysis, pull the salt out of seawater with electricity. The desert has no water, but it has a coast, and the coast has all the seawater in the world. The only problem is you need an enormous amount of electricity to do it, way out where there's no power for 1,000 miles. So you don't build the power station in the desert. You build it on a ship, a 5,000 kilowatt generator on a converted collier, and you sail the power plant to the edge of the desert and run the desalinated water inland from there. It should take a year. I give them 10 days, because that's how long the men at the railhead have. And here is where Asquith, who came to interrogate me, accidentally becomes my best witness. Because he's still here, and he watches all of Sydney's industry turn as one machine to rebuild that ship in 10 days. The foundries, the fitters, the electricians, every yard in the city working in shifts around the clock, synchronized like one enormous heart. He stands on the dock at midnight, watching the sparks fly and the hull transform, and he says, quietly, to no one in particular, "I have not seen efficiency like this in Liverpool. I have not seen it anywhere." The collier is reborn and renamed the Ark, and as she steams out, he turns to me with something new in his face. Not the interrogator anymore, just a man who's genuinely stopped understanding what he's looking at. "What kind of country are you building here, Alexander?" Out at the railhead, it's already hell. They're down to a pint of water a day per man. Fights are breaking out over a mouthful. Stevenson, who's out there himself because he always is, keeps order by sucking on a pebble to make spit and refusing to look afraid, walking the camp telling men to hold on one more day. And on the day the last barrel runs dry, a horseman comes galloping in from the coast, screaming something nobody can believe. There's a ship on the shore." 200 men march through the night toward the sea, half dead, following a rumor. And at dawn, they crest the last rise, and there she is, the Ark, run up on the coast, her strange tentacle pipes running out into the surf, her honeycomb of electrodialysis cells humming, and out of a spout on her side comes a thin, steady, gleaming trickle of fresh water. One of the men, a big, rough railway navvy who hasn't cried since he was a boy, stumbles forward, cups it in both filthy hands, drinks, and just stands there weeping, saying over and over, it's fresh water, it's fresh water." The telegram announcing it reaches me while I'm sitting across from Asquith. I read it out to him. Fresh water on the Nullarbor, made from the sea, by a ship. Asquith is quiet for a long moment, and then he says the word that tells me I've won. H.G. Wells. With respect, I tell him, H.G. Wells wrote novels. Out here we turn them into railways, every single day. And something shifts behind Asquith's brilliant eyes. The recognition, at last, that he isn't looking at a rebellious colony that needs managing. He's looking at something that's already outgrown the management. He changes his offer completely. No more taking our tomorrow in exchange for their yesterday. Instead, a Royal Australian Naval Squadron. It flies the white ensign, yes, nominally the Empire's, but the command, the budget, the crews, the building of it, all Australian. In return, we open our designs to the Admiralty, share the future instead of surrendering it. It's the deal I actually wanted, offered now as his idea, which is the only way a proud empire ever concedes anything. I take it. We shake on it, and I give him the toast. To the Empire. And he, this brilliant man who arrived certain he'd leave with my navy in his pocket, meets my eyes and finishes it. To the future. He knows which one of us just won. He's too smart not to. And in the spring of 1896, the two ends of the Great Railway finally reach for each other across the last stretch of that killing desert. They call the day the Federation Spring. A new explosive that finally bites through the limestone, the two work gangs closing the last gap from east and west, and a golden spike waiting to go down where they meet. I'm there, and I don't just watch. I go down the line shaking hands, and I make a point of it, gripping the calloused, cracked, iron-hard hands of the men who actually built the thing, because these hands, and not mine, are what turned a line on Stevenson's map into steel you can stand on. Asquith is there too, on his last night before sailing home, and we sit by a campfire out in the desert the railway just conquered, and he's a changed man. "When I get back," he says, watching the sparks go up, "I'm going to tell the Prime Minister the truth. Australia is not a child that needs a firm hand. It's a young giant, and the only sane policy toward a young giant is to become its partner before it stops needing you to be." He sails the next morning. The Empire's sharpest mind, going home to argue my case for me. I couldn't have bought that with all the gold in Kalgoorlie. Then the first real freight train rolls the whole length of the line, and it's not a ceremony, it's just work, which is why I love it. The driver's a plain-spoken man named Brian Murphy, 30 wagons behind him loaded with rails and ore crushers and 5,000 pairs of boots for the West. Halfway across the Nullarbor, a sandstorm swallows the train whole, and Murphy drives blind through it on nerve and timetable. And out in the middle of that emptiness, his train passes the eastbound one going the other way, 2 trains meeting in the dead center of a continent that 3 years ago you couldn't cross, and the drivers lean on their whistles and give each other a long salute through the flying sand. When Murphy finally rolls into Kalgoorlie, the whole gold town turns out to meet the freight like it's a returning relative. Because it is. It's the country arriving, on time, with boots. Kalgoorlie, though, is its own kind of problem, because 30,000 men chasing gold in the desert is less a town and more a riot with buildings. So I appoint a sheriff, and I do it partly as a joke that turns out to be the best hire I make. The man's name is Alexander G.K. Chesterton. Yes, that one, and I tell him, police it with the mind of Sherlock, not the fists of Watson. He takes it as the challenge I meant it as. He controls the one thing that matters in a desert, water, rationed by permit, bans firearms in town, and backs it with 20 Duntroon graduates who don't scare. There's a moment in a saloon, a classic gunslinger standoff with a killer called Scarface Joe, the whole room holding its breath while a clock ticks. 1, 2, and right on the count, the doors bang open and Chesterton's constables come through in a disciplined line with rifles level, and Scarface Joe discovers that the frontier just ended while he wasn't looking. Order arrives in Kalgoorlie, wearing a badge and a very smug expression. And to make it all feel real to ordinary people, we put the new banknote into their hands. The Royal Bank issues it out of its grand new building in Martin Place, and on the note, no distant crown, but a kangaroo and an emu beneath the Southern Cross, the country's own animals under the country's own sky. A young bank clerk named Sarah Miller changes the first 10 pounds of it, and the Herald runs her photograph on the front page under a headline that sticks, "The People's Pound." Because that's what it is now. Not London's money we're allowed to use. Ours. Everything is working. The radiator's joined, the gold's flowing, the money's ours, the Navy's building, the Empire's smartest man is on my side. Which is exactly the moment I should have been most afraid, because Richard Cavendish was watching all of it, and a man that beaten either leaves or turns into something worse. He turns into something worse. I hear about his new strategy secondhand, and it chills me more than any of his old attacks, because it's patient. "We won't dam the river anymore," he tells the men still loyal to him. "We'll poison it." We put our own people inside his unions. We fund the gangs in Kalgoorlie. We send our sons to his precious university, and we let it all rot from the inside, slowly, where he can't see it and can't fight it. He's done trying to beat the new Australia in a straight fight. He's decided to become a disease inside it instead. And the worst part is he's right about how to hurt me. Everything I've built is strong on the outside now, too strong to break with a bank run or a strike. But a thing built fast and wide has soft places on the inside, in the trust between people, and that's exactly where he's going to put the knife. I've spent 6 years building this country up. Now I'm going to have to learn to defend it from the inside out. The first place the poison shows up is the one place I can't just send cadets, inside the labor movement itself. The Navy's taking on sailors, and among them comes a scrawny, bespectacled Union man named Alexander Jenkins, who I clock immediately as one of O'Malley's people keeping an eye on the Prince's new fleet. Good, let him watch. What I don't expect is that Jenkins, who arrives quoting the naval theorist Mahan at a startled lieutenant named Fraser, turns out to be the sharpest political mind to walk through my door in years. 6 months in, he's the best cadet on the base, and he gives a speech that stops me cold. We are not iron, he tells a room of sailors. We are men. Build the ship around the man, not the man around the ship. Fraser, listening, goes quiet and thoughtful. I make a note. Jenkins is either going to be my greatest ally or my most dangerous rival, and possibly both. I'm right on all counts. But the real strike lands at Newcastle, and it starts, deliberately, as almost nothing. A worker named Aiden makes a small mistake and gets docked half a day's pay for it. Routine, fair, the kind of thing that happens 100 times a week. Except this time, a foreman named Patrick Chesterton, who has quietly taken Cavendish's money, is standing right there to fan the spark. "Half a day's pay," he roars. Their rulebook's thicker than the Bible, and every page is written against us. And within a day, there's a wildcat strike at the steelworks with a list of demands that don't quite make sense. Drop all fines, sack the German engineer Helmut, make Richter himself apologize, and a shadowy new outfit calling itself the Workers' Brotherhood is running it, set explicitly against O'Malley's official union as too soft, too bought, too cozy with the prince. It spreads, the rail depot, then Cockatoo Island, where a third of the shipyard walks off demanding the German engineer's wages be cut. And O'Malley and Jenkins, watching it move, both notice the same wrong note. The demands are chaos, the proper union procedures are being skipped, and somebody is paying the Brotherhood leaders out of murky mutual aid funds that appear from nowhere. This isn't workers organizing, it's workers being played. Then a note reaches O'Malley, unsigned, from someone calling himself only APA. A pub, the Mermaid's Song, 7 o'clock. The man waiting for O'Malley in the corner of the Mermaid's Song, in a plain coat with a pint of dark ale in front of him, is me. I don't waste his time. I put Thornton's work on the table between us, the money trail, followed link by link. Walter Raleigh's bank, into anonymous accounts, into the mutual aid funds, into Patrick Chesterton's pocket. They're not funding workers, Sam, I tell him. They're funding the stupidest, angriest voices they can find, and they're pointing them at the thing you and I built together. O'Malley's face goes dark as he reads, because he's looking at his own movement being turned into a weapon against itself. So why come to me, he says. You've got the CSB, you've got proof, arrest the lot. Because if the prince's police crush a workers' movement, I've proved Cavendish's point for him, and every worker in the country learns the government is the enemy. I lean in. This is an infection in your body, Sam. The body has to make the antibodies. You find me a living witness. You let the union cut out its own tumor, and I'll build the stage where the whole country gets to watch it happen. He's quiet a while. Then he asks the real question, the one under all of it. Why do you trust us to do it? And I tell him the truth, because he'll know a lie. Because you love the working men of this country more than I ever could. I only run the place. You're one of them. He puts out his hand, and we shake on it in the corner of a dockside pub, a prince and a union boss against a dead man's money. Getting the living witness is Alexander Jenkins's job, and Alexander Jenkins is about to prove he'd have made a terrifying spy. He shaves his beard, takes a false name, and hires himself onto a brickyard as a nobody with a barrow, working his hands to bleeding rags so the calluses look right, and he listens. He learns how the Brotherhood really works, a little cash up front, big promises later, and a lot of drink. And he zeroes in on the weak link, a Brotherhood enforcer called Steeljaw Pete, who loves cards and can't play them. Jenkins loses to him, cheerfully, night after night, buying the man's friendship a hand at a time, until one drunk evening, Steeljaw Pete lets it slip. Every Wednesday, midnight, Chesterton goes to the old warehouse, number 3, comes back with his pockets full. Jenkins finishes the hand, loses again on purpose, and walks out into the dark with exactly what we needed. The trap closes on a Wednesday, in a thunderstorm, at warehouse number 3. O'Malley's there with 20 dockmen carrying cargo hooks, all of us waiting in the dark and the rain. And in comes Chesterton, and in comes a smooth gentleman from Raleigh's bank carrying a case of brand new banknotes, and we listen to the gentleman say the words that hang them both. Keep it up, and the prince's factories become scrap metal, and that's when the doors blow in. A cargo hook takes the revolver right out of the gentleman's hand before he can clear it. Chesterton ends up on his knees in the wet with 20 furious dockworkers around him, and in the corner, calm as you like, a pair of stenographers I brought along write down every word of the confession that comes pouring out of him. And then I do the thing Cavendish never saw coming, the thing that turns a police matter into the political education of an entire nation. I put it on the radio. The hearing is broadcast live over Sokolov's network to the whole country at once, the first trial in human history that a nation listens to together in its own kitchens. O'Malley lays out the chain of evidence, clear and merciless, in his own working man's voice. Chesterton, in chains, breaks down completely on the air, sobbing that he betrayed his own brothers for money, that he's no hero, that he's a rat, and he knows it. The strike is declared illegal. The workers, who heard the whole thing with their own ears, go quietly back to work, not because they were forced, but because they were shown. The brotherhood evaporates overnight. And millions of Australians learn, in a single evening around the wireless, exactly how the old money tried to buy their anger and use it against them. But the smartest move I make in the whole affair is the one that costs me the most pride. Because when the storm's over, I don't punish the workers who marched. I forgive them. Every one. More than that, I order the steelworks to look at why the lie caught fire so fast. Because a lie only spreads on dry tinder, and the tinder here was real. Bad food in the canteen, no decent work clothes, a fine system that treated grown men like naughty children. Richter, my brilliant German metallurgist, is furious. These men just tried to make him grovel, and now I'm rewarding them? The lie was theirs, I tell him, but the kindling was ours. Fix the kindling. So the fines get replaced with a merit system. The canteen gets rebuilt, suggestion boxes go up on the floor, and Jenkins writes a 100-page report that becomes the factory management supplementary agreement. O'Malley stands up in front of the men and apologizes for letting the movement get infiltrated. And a week later, in the Mermaid's song, the union boss raises a pint to the prince, and means it. Cavendish tried to split labor from the crown. He welded them tighter. So Cavendish stops going after the big targets he can't crack and starts hunting the small ones who can't fight back. And this is where the war stops being a game and someone dies. He calls it, privately, the hunt, and the prey are the small businessmen, the little sawmills and canneries and vineyards I've been backing with cheap federal loans, the stars of the Federation. The first one is a man named Robert Price, who runs a modest railway sleeper mill down at Mount Gambier. Cavendish's people, through a smiling credit manager named Cartwright, first flatter Davies into a bigger loan than he needs. Then they spring the fine print, the loans called, in full, in a week. At the same time, the timber supplier who is going to fill Davies's big new order mysteriously burns down because Cavendish quietly bought it. And Davies's best workers get poached with wages he can't match. In the space of a month, a healthy little business is deliberately, surgically strangled into bankruptcy. And Robert Price, ruined, shamed, unable to face the men he'd promised work to, takes his own life in his office. His wife is the one who finds him. I get the news at my desk, and I sit with it a long time, and I don't reach for a scheme or a countermove, because there isn't one that brings a man back. There's just a widow at Mount Gambier, and a name I'm going to remember. This is the first person my war with Cavendish has killed, and he was a man I never met, who trusted alone with my government's name on it. I put that where I keep the things that don't let me sleep. Then I find out Davies was only the first shot, because it's a conveyor belt. A cannery owner named Thompson hit with the same trick, an extra $5,000 in collateral demanded inside a week. Impossible. Done. A vineyard in the Barossa, a meatworks in Queensland whose shipping wagons keep mysteriously getting delayed until the meat spoils. Something like 20 small businesses driven under in 2 months, their machinery snapped up by Cavendish's men for pennies, and all the while the Sydney Morning Herald tut-tuts that the economy is overheating, and it's really the governor's reckless expansion that's to blame. Thornton sends out a map of the country with a box of red pins, and he pushes one in for every dead business, and slowly a shape appears, a corridor of ruin running right along my new railways, my proudest achievement turned into the murderer's road. This is not a market, Your Highness, he says, and I've never heard him so cold. Markets are chaos. This is a pattern. This is a surgical war fought with credit instead of cannon. He takes off his glasses. I'm going to go and cut it open myself. And Edward Thornton, the greatest economist of the age, puts on a rough coat and becomes a detective. He goes down to Mount Gambier himself with a clerk and a lawyer and no announcement, and he sits in the Widow Davies's parlor and reads the loan papers line by line. And what he finds is worse than fraud, because fraud is at least illegal. What he finds is a trap built entirely out of legal clauses. A term buried in the contract that lets the lender declare unforeseen adverse conditions and call the loan on a whim, with the sole right to decide what counts as adverse resting with the lender. He traces the burned timber supplier, the poached workers, the peaches bought up at 30% over market through shell companies, and every thread runs back through a different false name to the same leather chairs at the Australian Club. His report reads like a coroner's. It is robbery, he tells me, conducted entirely within the law. They are shipping the nooses down our own railways, wrapped in contracts we can't touch. I read it twice, and then I ask him a question about animals. Thornton, when lions hunt antelope on the plains, and the antelope can't outrun the lion, what do the antelope do? He looks at me. They form a circle, I say. Herd together, the weak in the middle, horns pointing out. One antelope is dinner. 1,000 antelope with their horns out is a wall no lion charges. I stand up. I don't want to catch this lion. I want to build the circle. I need a financial weapon that lets every small business in this country stand back to back. Go invent it. Thornton walks out without saying goodbye, the way he does when I've handed him a problem worth his whole mind. He locks himself away for 3 days, and what he comes out with is a new thing in the world. The Federal Industrial Development Guarantee Fund. Government capital plus a tiny levy of 0.1% on every member's turnover, and in exchange, 2 shields. 1. If a lender ever maliciously calls a healthy business's loan, the fund provides an emergency bridge loan within 24 hours, so no one can ever be strangled in a week again. 2. Free legal help and the right to bring class actions, so one antelope's fight becomes 1,000 antelopes' fight. Thornton lays it out, and I actually laugh out loud with the beauty of it. Thornton, do you understand what you've built? It's an economic alliance. Attack one member, and the whole herd answers. You've built NATO for small business. And we don't stop there. We add the other half, the Federal Enterprise Credit Rating Bureau, which rates every business openly, plain names anyone can understand. Bedrock, eucalyptus, or noxious weed. And the ratings are compulsory reading for every bank, because Cavendish's whole game ran on shadows, on nobody being able to see who was solid and who was rotten. Information asymmetry, Thornton says, almost happy, is the nursery of every financial crime. So we turn the lights on. Somewhere across town, I'm told, Walter Raleigh reads about it in the morning paper and drops his lit cigar straight onto his own carpet. Then we test the circle, and we test it in the best possible way, by saving a man in the exact act of being murdered. His name is James Cartwright, a Boer War veteran who invented a harvesting machine, and he's caught in the identical trap that killed Davies, Cartwright, the Smile, 3,000 pounds demanded in a week. By the time our people reach him, he has already written the note. He's already decided. And a Ford motor car comes up his drive with the fund's lawyers in it and a bridge loan in hand, and a letter stamped with a federal seal 24 hours after his loan was called, and James Cartwright does not become the second Robert Price. And then the fund does the thing the old money never expected the antelope to do. It doesn't just save him, it counterattacks. It files a class action lawsuit, Cartwright and every other victim together, against Raleigh's bank and its shell companies. Raleigh folds before it ever reaches a courtroom, because a trial would open his books, and his books lead to the club. He settles, compensation to every ruined family, and a week of public apologies printed in every newspaper in the country. The antelope brought down the lion. Raleigh's bank hemorrhages 1/3 of its depositors overnight, and for the first time, the men in the leather chairs understand that the game has changed for good. Cavendish sits in the wreckage of his financial war, and, being who he is, he doesn't repent. He recalculates. We've lost the battle for the present, he tells the last of his loyalists, looking older than I've ever seen him. So we stop fighting for the present. And his eyes go, of all places, to my university. We fight for the mind of the next generation instead. I should have taken that more seriously than I did, because the next front he opens isn't about money at all. It's about ideas. And ideas are the one thing you can't put a battery of cadets around. It arrives wrapped as a gift, which is how the best poison always arrives. The Cavendish Foundation, his money, cleaned up and given a respectable name, donates £200,000 to my university for a chair of political and economic philosophy. A generous, civic, unimpeachable gift, and it comes with a professor already attached. Quentin Fairfax, Oxford, a smooth and famous social Darwinist. And Fairfax's first lecture to a hall of my brightest young Australians is called The Logic of the Strong, and its thesis is simple and seductive. Equality is a lie the mediocre tell to chain the exceptional. The strong are meant to rule. The weak are meant to serve. And your federation, with its minimum wage and its treaty with savages and its coin with two faces, your federation is a sentimental crime against nature. It lands the way that poison always lands on clever young men who want to be told they're special. A student named Cedric Gray, heir to a grazing fortune, founds an Atlas Society to spread the gospel. Stevenson comes to me alarmed, wanting it shut down. And I make a mistake, and I know it might be one even as I make it. Truth doesn't fear a debate, I tell him. Let him lecture. Let the boy have his society. Let Cavendish pay for it. I believe that. I still mostly believe it. But I underestimate how patient Cavendish is, and how a poison you allow to stay in the room has a way of looking for the door to the rest of the house. Because it isn't one front, it's two, and I nearly miss that they're the same war. Front one is the Atlas Society, attacking the Federation in pamphlets and lecture halls, all ideas and ink. Front two is 800 miles away in Red Rock Valley, Queensland, where a race conflict has suddenly turned violent. Settlers and Aboriginal people, and both sides, impossibly, are armed with the same brand new Winchester rifles, sold to them by a traveling gunrunner who calls himself Viper Pete. Ideas in the south, bullets in the north. And it takes me a beat too long to see the wire connecting them. The same money, the same hand, fighting me with philosophy where I'm strong and with rifles where I'm far away. So I build the thing I've been avoiding building, because it frightens me a little to build it. A Commonwealth Security Bureau, an intelligence service, and I put G.K. Chesterton at its head, and I give it 3 rules I carve in stone precisely because I know what a secret police becomes without them. It acts only on evidence that would stand up in a real court. It never uses lethal force, and nothing happens without my personal signature. A scalpel, I tell Chesterton, not a butcher's cleaver. The day this becomes a cleaver, it's cut out the heart of the thing it was meant to protect. Chifley, that serious boy from Duntroon, becomes my agent on the frontier, and the net starts to close. It closes slowly, and then all at once. The CSB cracks the telegrams first, Fairfax writing to Cavendish's lawyer Fitzwilliam, and the letters contain something that turns my stomach. A list of my own students, ranked by ideological assessment, being groomed and sorted like livestock. Out on the frontier, Chifley spends a month tracking Viper Pete with Aboriginal trackers who read the land better than any map. He takes him by offering double the price for a rifle shipment. And in Jack's hidden strongbox is a ledger, money flowing from Fitzwilliam's and Raleigh's shell companies to buy guns for both sides of a race war. Because a country tearing itself apart along that line can't build navies. It can't build universities. It can barely build a fence. And then, a mole inside the club, an informer the CSB calls Nightingale, hands us the whole thing, the final plan, the big one Cavendish has been building toward under all the small attacks. A national railway strike, timed with the simultaneous bombing of 3 key points: the Great Bridge over the Murray, the tunnel through the Blue Mountains, and the signal hub in the desert. Paralyze the continent for a year. Wreck the economy, the confidence, the union between the states. And then have his men step forward as the only ones who can restore order, return as the saviors of the very chaos they created. I read that plan twice, and the fear I feel turns very quickly into something cold and clear. Operation Thunder, I tell Chesterton. We don't cut the branches this time. We take the whole thing out by the roots, every name in that ledger, on the same night. Thunder comes down at 3 in the morning, and it comes down without a single shot fired. Every conspirator in the country arrested in the same hour, in their beds, before any of them can send a warning or reach for a match. Walter Raleigh, I'm told, falls out of bed with his mistress when the CSB knocks. Not one bomb goes off, not one railway is cut, and then, instead of quiet trials in quiet rooms, I do the thing that finishes the old world for good. I put it all on the radio. The trial of the century, they call it, and the whole nation hears it live. The first time in human history, a Supreme Court trial is broadcast to an entire people at once. Chesterton lays the evidence out like a surgeon, the ledgers and the telegrams and the confessions, the whole architecture of the plot, in a calm, clear voice going into every home in Australia. There's nowhere to hide from evidence a nation heard with its own ears. Cavendish gets life. And the old man, who ran this country from a leather chair for 40 years, breaks in the dock, not physically, but something behind his eyes goes out when he understands, finally, completely, that he lost, and that the country he thought he owned watched him lose. Raleigh and Fitzwilliam get their long sentences. Fairfax is thrown out of the university in disgrace, his ideas exposed as another man's paid weapon. The club's assets are seized and poured into a national welfare fund, the old money, at last, doing something for the country it fleeced. And the Australian club itself, that dark, quiet room where the real decisions used to be made, is closed and turned into a museum, so school children can walk through it and learn how the country used to be run in the past tense. The old era is over. I broke the men who owned Australia before I got here, and I broke them in the open, with the whole nation listening. And in the middle of that triumph, at the very peak of it, a telegram comes from London that stops the world. Let me tell you first where I was standing, because it matters. It's 1900. They're calling it the Golden Start, and for once the newspapers and I agree on something. In 10 years, the empty continent at the bottom of the map has become a country that scares people. National income of 30 million. A second blast furnace roaring at Newcastle. The cruiser Sydney nearly finished in her dock. Von Richthofen's submarine laboratory quietly working under the water. Sokolov's grid humming in every capital. Stevens's flying machine, the Albatross II, actually leaving the ground. Votes for women. Free schooling for every child. The men who laughed me out of a London drawing room and called it Convicts and Kangaroos now read about Australia in their morning papers with something between envy and fear, and they eat those two words with a silver fork, exactly like I promised. And I am not there to watch because I stopped needing to watch a long time ago. That's where I'm standing, on top of everything I came here to build. And the telegram says, the Queen is dying. I sail nothing. There's no time, and there's nothing to sail toward but a deathbed I won't reach. So I wait, in my study, with my grandfather's meteorite in my hand, the piece of iron from the place with no borders, and on the 22nd of January 1901, the second telegram comes. Queen Helena is dead. And here is the one moment in this whole story where I don't have a scheme, or a counter-move, or a clever line to undercut the weight of it. I just sit down. She was the only one. When every powdered lord in that room was laughing, when my own father wanted me buried alive in India, when the whole empire had decided I was a disgrace to be exported, one small woman in black looked at a boy nobody believed and decided to spend her hope on him, which for a widow of 30 years was the most expensive thing she owned. She made me a country out of a single sentence. She told me not to disgrace the name of Albert, and she pressed a piece of the sky into my hand and told me to remember what I was. I close my hand around that iron until it hurts. I didn't disgrace it, grandmother, I say, to an empty room, to a woman 8,000 miles and one whole life away. I built something Albert would have walked inside and wept over. I didn't fail you. And for a little while, the man who runs a nation is just a grandson who lost the one person who believed in him before there was anything to believe in. And I let it be exactly that, and I don't reach for a single joke, because some things you don't say out loud, and some griefs you don't dress up. Then I stand up, because she'd have had no patience at all for a grandson who sat in the dark when there was work to do. The mourning is real, but I make sure the words are precise. Australia grieves, as an independent commonwealth offering its condolences, and every diplomat in London who reads that phrase understands exactly what it means. The old queen who made me is gone. Her son Harry, George V now, sits the throne. The personal thread that tied Australia to the crown has been cut, and everything is up for renegotiation, and every shark in the empire knows it. So I make a decision that horrifies my cabinet. I'm going to London, myself, at the head of the delegation. Not to grieve, or not only to grieve. We are going to mourn a queen, I tell them, but we are going to do a great deal more bargaining than mourning. I take Barton, I take Clark, I take our best speakers, and two people no delegation like this has ever brought. Sergeant Kelly, an ordinary soldier with a Helena cross and no polish whatsoever, and Dr. Florence Nightingale, a woman scientist, because I want London to meet the actual Australia, not a costume of it. I leave the CSB running on a protocol I name Watchman, and I put my grandfather's meteorite in my breast pocket, over my heart, where I can feel it. The boy they exiled to the ends of the earth is going back to London. He's going back with a nation behind him, and this time the drawing room is going to have to make room. The delegation sails on the Southern Cross, and I pin the badge of the Southern Cross constellation to my coat, and somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean, I stop being the boy who left and start being the thing that's coming back. London doesn't know it yet. London thinks it's receiving a grieving colonial governor. London is about to receive a negotiator with a navy. The first move is dinner, and it's a private one, and it's the most dangerous meal of the whole trip. Uncle Harry, King George V now, has me to a private supper, just the two of us, and it starts warm, family stories. The old man remembers me as a disgraced boy he pressed cigars on at a dock, and there's real fondness there, and I let it be real, because it is. And then, somewhere between the soup and the fish, the fondness gets a blade in it, because Edward is nobody's fool, and he knows exactly why I've come. A navy, he says, swirling his wine. You've built yourself a proper little navy down there. Cruisers of your own design. German engineers, one hears. He sets the glass down. The Empire's fleet is one fleet, Alexander. One mind, one command, one sea. It always has been. You understand that a family doesn't let one son keep his own private army in the garden. And here's the whole game, laid out over the fish course. He wants my navy folded into the Royal Navy, my ships, London's orders. I want the opposite, and I can't say so directly to a king at his own table, so I don't. The Empire's fleet is one fleet in the North Sea, Uncle, I say. But when a Japanese squadron comes into the Coral Sea, that fleet is 6 weeks away, and my people are right there. I'm not asking to leave the family. I'm asking for tactical autonomy, my ships answering my admirals in my waters, under one Imperial Naval Committee where the whole family sits down as equals and agrees the strategy together. Edward looks at me for a long moment, and something in his face does the thing I'll never forget. It stops being an uncle looking at a nephew and becomes one head of state measuring another. He doesn't concede. Kings don't concede over fish. He does something worse for me. He passes me off. That, he says, is a matter for my ministers. You'll want to speak to Asquith and to Curzon. And he smiles, because he knows he's just handed me to the two hardest men in the Empire. Asquith, at least, is a man I've already beaten once, at a campfire in the desert. He's prime minister now, and when I sit down with him, he's exactly what I remember. Brilliant, civilized, and genuinely persuaded that the Empire should stay one thing. But the desert changed him too, and he opens generously. The Empire, Asquith says, should be a club of equals. I've said as much in cabinet and been called a romantic for it. On trade, on diplomacy in your own ocean, I think you should have your latitude. It's the most a British Prime Minister has ever offered a colony, and he offers it because he saw fresh water pulled out of a desert by a ship and never quite recovered. And then I meet Curzon, and Curzon is a wall. Joseph Curzon runs the colonial office, and he does not deal in Asquith's elegant latitudes. He deals in the machine of empire, and to him, the machine has one engine. Let me be plain, since you value plainness, he says, and he is plain. A fleet is one brain or it is nothing. The Admiralty is the brain. You will place your ships under it, and you will pay your share into the common naval fund, and in return, you will enjoy the protection of the greatest navy the world has ever seen. That is the offer. That is loyalty. Anything else is a boy playing with warships in a bathtub and calling it a nation. I don't raise my voice, because raising your voice at Curzon is how you lose to Curzon. Responsibility, I tell him, must be equal to rights. You ask my people to pay for a fleet and hand you the key to their own security, and to trust that when the moment comes, London will spend English lives to defend a coast 8,000 miles away before it defends the Channel. My people will not hand you that key. Not because they don't love the Empire, because they've done the arithmetic on how far away you are. We stare at each other across a very cold table, and neither of us moves, and the meeting ends in a frost you could store meat in. That night, in a rented house in Mayfair, I turn the room into the same war room the Britannia was 10 years ago. I lay the two men out for my people like a map. Asquith is reason. Asquith can be brought along. Curzon is obstruction, and he cannot, so we don't try. We go around him. 2 orders. Clark, build me a file on Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. Every grievance they hold against London, every interest they share with us, because I'm not going to win this as one colony against the Empire. Get Thornton's numbers on Curzon's precious imperial tariff scheme, and start selling our case in the press back home. Because a leader with his own country restless behind him is a weak negotiator, and I intend to arrive at every table with mine solidly at my back. And then, because I've learned that the real fights happen in corridors, I go to the one room in London where nobody's watching, the Admiralty itself. They receive me in a room full of oil paintings of dead admirals, and the first Sea Lord, Bertram Ramsay, the most dangerous sailor alive, the man who's about to build the dreadnought and reset every navy on Earth, receives me like a headmaster receiving a clever, tiresome boy. The sea, Your Highness, Ramsay says, is indivisible. You cannot own a piece of it any more than you can own a piece of the wind. There is one navy. You may pay into it, or you may buy your ships from it, under our command. Those are the doors. There is no third door. And his admirals, around the table, make a soft, ugly little insinuation about the German engineers in my yards. Collusion, they call it. Almost, not quite, a colony in bed with the Kaiser. I let Clark answer the sea part, and Clark does it with a map. He spreads the Pacific across their table and puts one finger on Sydney and one on London. An order from this room, he says, reaches our fleet in a day. A day, gentlemen, by your own cable. You are asking our sailors to fight a battle in their own waters with their eyes closed and their hands tied, waiting on a telegram from a room on the other side of the world. That is not one navy. That is a blindfold. And I close it. As for the German engineers, give us the technology ourselves and we won't have to go looking for it elsewhere. I let that hang, the small threat inside it perfectly visible. But make no mistake, if London will not sell us tomorrow, we will find tomorrow somewhere else. We leave the Admiralty with no agreement and a room full of furious old men, and out on the steps in the London fog, I understand something clean and cold and useful. You do not argue respect out of an empire. Clark, I say, watching the ships on the Grey River, every argument in that room bounced off them like rain. There's only one language they actually hear. I think of the Sydney in her dock, nearly done. The furnaces at Cockatoo need to burn hotter. You earn a seat at that table with rows of steel ships, not with speeches. So we're going to go and build the argument they can't answer. And while we do it, we're going to make some friends the Admiralty forgot they should worry about. The friends are the other children London orders around, and they're all in town for the funeral, which is convenient. I have quiet dinners with the men who run the other dominions, Borden of Canada, Ward of New Zealand, Smuts's people from South Africa, and I discover I'm not the only one who's tired of being managed. Borden won't touch Curzon's tariff union with a barge pole because it had wrecked Canadian industry to please English manufacturers. Ward, the great blunt bull of New Zealand, leans across the table and says the thing they're all thinking. The old men in London do not understand the Pacific. They think it's a map. We live on it. I plant a seed with him about free trade across the Tasman, just between us, and I watch it take. By the time I'm done, there's the beginning of something London has never had to face, a block, the dominions with their horns pointed the same direction, and me as the one quietly holding the circle together. I even reach further than the family. I meet, very discreetly, with an envoy from Qing China, Ambassador Li Wei, and I offer the thing no European power offers China in 1901, an honest trade, our steel and metals and wool for their silk and tea and tungsten, joint ventures where I don't demand the controlling share, and Australian engineers to train Chinese ones. China, still bleeding from the Boxer disaster and sick to death of being carved up, finds a man from the bottom of the world offering partnership instead of a knife genuinely startling. It's a small door, but I've learned that the century turns on who's standing in the doorways when the big rooms catch fire. And while I work the men, I let two ordinary Australians quietly conquer London for me, which they do better than any diplomat could. The first is Dr. Florence Nightingale. I get her in front of the Royal Society, the great temple of British science. She stands up in a room full of men who have never once imagined being lectured by a woman from the colonies. And she puts up her slides, the standard treatment for polio, the splint and the dead limb, next to her own method, movement and warmth, and a leg that works again. The room goes silent. It's the particular silence of very proud men watching their certainty come apart. She demonstrates at Buckingham Palace itself, and Queen Mary weeps at what she sees, and by the end there are 3 Nightingale clinics opening in Britain, and a colonial nurse walking around London as a royal medical consultant. Meanwhile, Thornton is signing research treaties with Cambridge and Oxford and Imperial College, quietly buying my university a share of the best minds in England. The second is Sergeant Kelly, and Ryan is my favorite gamble of the whole trip, because I don't polish him at all. Everyone advises me to clean the man up before London sees him. He's rough, he's plain, he drops his H's. I do the opposite. I let him be exactly what he is, an ordinary soldier with a Helena cross for doing something impossible under fire and no idea how to be anything but himself. I take him to Sandhurst and he shows the cadets how to build a stretcher out of 2 rifles and a coat. I take him to Eton, where the boys ask him what wealth means, and he says, "Wealth, young sirs, is knowing how to stay alive when everything's gone," and you can hear a pin drop. And I take him to a working men's pub in the East End, where he sits down with London miners and dockers, and they recognize one of their own, and the papers run his photograph the next morning under a headline that does more for Australia than every speech I've made. A brother from the South. London came expecting a nation of convicts and kangaroos. It got a doctor who humbles the Royal Society, and a soldier its own workers claim as kin. The whole picture of us turns over in a fortnight. And underneath all of it, in the shadows, the Watchman network I left running has quietly gone to work in London too. The CSB's people here, an ex-banker they call Watchmaker, and a woman moving through high society who signs herself Nightingale, bring me things over quiet weeks that are worth more than any dinner. An informant inside the colonial office. A decrypted cable from the German naval attaché that tells me something I file away carefully. Berlin is genuinely frightened of what's growing in Sydney. And the shape of the real fault lines inside the Admiralty, who hates whom, where the cracks are. I give one order back through the network, looking at that German cable. Open a line to American intelligence, because Washington and I are both lying awake at night about the same rising sun in the east, and 2 men afraid of the same thing should know each other's telephone number. I came to London to grieve a queen. I'm leaving it with a Dominion block, a Chinese door, a conquered Royal Society, and a spy network reading the Empire's mail. But none of that wins the actual fight, because the actual fight is over a single word, and it's coming at a conference where they mean to outvote me. The word is colonial. They call it the Colonial Conference, where the Dominions come to London to be told what the Empire has decided. And my first move, before we argue a single line of substance, is to change its name. It sounds like nothing. It's everything. I push, with the whole Dominion block quietly behind me, to rename it the Imperial Conference. Imperial, a conference of the Empire's parts, not a headmaster's assembly of colonies, and to give it a permanent secretariat, a standing body, with a British Secretary General but rotating deputies from the Dominions. Curzon fights it because Curzon understands exactly what I understand. Whoever writes the rules of the room owns everything decided in it. It's a change of stationery, one of his people scoffs. It's a change of who's in charge, I don't bother to say out loud. We win the name. And the name, it turns out, is the whole war in miniature. The night before the real session, I gather the Dominion leaders one more time in Mayfair, Borden, Ward, the South Africans, and we agree our 4 points and a private code to signal each other across the table. They'll try to take us one at a time, I tell them, so we don't answer one at a time. Attack one of us on tariffs, all 4 speak. Attack one on the fleet, all 4 speak. A lion charges a single antelope. It does not charge the wall. Borden, the elegant old Canadian, looks at me for a moment and says, "You know, Your Highness, you are cutting a path here for all of us." I tell him the truth. I'm cutting it for myself. You're all just welcome to walk it. And then the Imperial Conference of 1902 opens, and Curzon leads with his grand dream, and I take it apart with a spreadsheet. His Imperial Customs Union, 1 tariff wall around the whole empire, free trade inside, everyone buying British, is the centerpiece of his life's work, and it dies at that table, because when he unveils it, I don't make a passionate speech about sovereignty. I have Barton lay Thornton's numbers on the table, exactly how much each Dominion's own young industries would be gutted to feed British factories. 15% off our manufacturing, and comparable wounds for Canada. And Borden, right on cue, backs me, and then the wall speaks all at once, and Curzon's dream of a captive imperial market collapses under its own arithmetic, defeated not by rebellion, but by a column of figures. Then comes the fleet, and Ramsay, and the moment I actually sailed 8,000 miles for. Ramsay makes his case again. The ocean is indivisible. Your little Dominion navies are toys, one fleet or nothing. And I make my offer. And it's the offer I've been building toward since Curzon first froze me out. I propose the Imperial Naval Committee, a real table where the Dominions and Britain plan the Empire's naval strategy together, as equals, with defined command zones, our fleet answering our admirals in our waters. And I know they'll never agree to it for nothing, so I put my chip on the table, and it's a big one. Australia will build and gift a battleship, a full modern capital ship, to the home fleet in the North Sea, a gift worth more than the whole rest of the argument. And the room shifts, because now I'm not a rebellious colony hoarding its toy navy. I'm a partner contributing a battleship to the common defense and asking, reasonably, for a seat at the table where the battleships are commanded. Ramsay grinds his teeth, but Asquith sees the shape of it, and the compromise carries. The Imperial Naval Committee is created, the command zones are recognized, and my fleet, my Australian-commanded fleet in Australian waters, is real, in writing, acknowledged by the Empire itself. I gave them one battleship. I bought my nation's strategic independence with it. It's the best trade of my life. And I sail home having done the impossible thing, the thing that pays off a promise I made to myself in a drawing room 12 years ago. The boy they exiled to the land of convicts and kangaroos went back to the heart of the empire and made it treat him as an equal, not by begging and not by rebelling, but by being too valuable and too clever to refuse. Sydney meets the returning delegation with a roar, though not everyone's cheering. The Herald calls it a triumph. The Conservatives grumble about what a gift battleship is going to cost the taxpayer. And in my own cabinet, when the celebrating's done, we sit down and do the thing I love most, treat the whole triumph as a cost-benefit problem and squeeze the next move out of it. Orders go out. Speed up Cockatoo. Fund the naval program through a special bond issue so the battleship gift doesn't gut the budget. Push the trade talks with America and Canada that London can no-gone block. And make the transcontinental standard gauge line project #1, because a nation that can move a battleship's worth of steel across itself in a week is a nation nobody blockades easily. I've conquered the drawing room. Now I'm going to make sure Australia never has to walk into anyone else's again, starting by cutting the wire that runs every one of our words through London first. Every telegram Australia sends the world runs through London or through the Suez Cable, which means the Empire reads our mail before we've finished writing it. So I lay a wire of my own, the All-Red Line, a submarine cable straight across the Pacific from Southport to Vancouver, Canada, bypassing London and Suez entirely. The first message that crosses it is from Borden, and it feels like the first breath a diver takes coming up. The end of our isolation, I tell the room. An artery between equals, and not one drop of it passes through anyone else's heart. Sokolov, naturally, looks at my beautiful new cable and tells me I'm cracking nuts with a bar of gold. You have laid the finest wire in the world, he says, and you are sending it messages a clever boy could read. So he builds the thing that makes the cable a weapon, a project he calls Pulse, frequency-modulated signaling that's, in his words, mathematically unbreakable. 6 months, top secret. And with it, I build a Federal Economic Information Office that gets me the Chicago grain prices and the London money rates before the London bankers have finished reading them, and a private channel to Canada and Washington that no one in the Admiralty can tap. Information, I've decided, is the one weapon you can point at every enemy at once. But the cable and the battleship and the great programs all cost money, and money is where a triumph nearly turns into a funeral. The bill for the gift battleship and the naval expansion hits the Parliament, and the Parliament revolts. The Conservative press screams that the battleship is a tribute to London dressed up as a gift, that we're bleeding the farmers to buy the Empire a warship. A backbencher named Caldwell leads a farmers' revolt, and the numbers turn against me, and for a few days it genuinely looks like my own Parliament is going to vote down the budget and kill the naval program that I sold my strategic independence to build. So I do the thing I've been building the tools for since a shed by the harbor lit a bulb out of thin air. I go over the Parliament's head and talk to the whole country at once. 8 in the evening, on Sokolov's national network, the first time a leader has ever spoken directly to an entire nation in its own kitchens, I make my case in plain words. They are calling this a tribute. It is not a tribute. When German battleships sat in our harbor and we could do nothing but watch, that was the price of weakness. This fleet is not a gift to London. It is an insurance policy taken out by the people of this country against ever being that helpless again. You are not paying tribute. You are buying for your children the freedom to never be afraid in their own harbor. And the taverns erupt, and the telegrams start, and by morning the parliament is buried under an avalanche of them from ordinary people saying, "Spend the money," and the budget passes by a crushing majority. The radio didn't just entertain the nation, it just governed it. The parliament, humiliated, does what humiliated parliaments do, it turns to spite. 100 small revenges, 37 amendments to a road bill, month-long inquiries into the shape of a kiwi, a soft, grinding paralysis, the backbenchers punishing me for going over their heads by gumming up every gear I need. And leading the sulk is Caldwell, the farmer's champion, who fully expects me to crush him for it. I don't crush him. I hire him. I call Caldwell in, and he comes braced for the axe. And instead, I offer him the chair of the Royal Agricultural and Water Resources Committee, the biggest agricultural brief in the country. Real power, real budget, the exact thing he claims to care about. He's stunned. I don't need enemies, Caldwell, I tell him. I need people who solve problems. So here's your choice. Take this and go actually fix the thing you shout about, or refuse it and admit to yourself that your concern for the farmers was only ever a stick to beat me with. Which is it? He takes it. Of course he takes it. And then I send him out to find out whether he meant a word of it. Caldwell's education happens in a saddle, in the dust, and it's the making of him. I send him out to the drought country on horseback with an engineer named Shaw and the agronomist Gibson. No comforts, eating hardtack, a backbencher who's never had dirt under his nails, learning what his own slogans actually cost. And one night, out in the parched dark, armed farmers ride up on the party, men at the absolute end of their rope, and one of them recognizes him and levels a rifle. I know you, Caldwell. You used us. You waved us about in your speeches like a flag and did nothing. And it's Gibson, quietly, who diffuses it. He picks up a sheaf of wheat and leads them all, in the dark, to an experimental plot, where a stand of green, drought-resistant wheat is growing impossibly out of dead, gray ground. And an old farmer sinks to his knees in front of it and drops his rifle and weeps, because he's looking at a future he'd stopped believing in. Caldwell comes back a changed man. For the first time, he tells me, and he means it, the title feels heavy. And for the first time, it feels like it's worth something. I turned my angriest enemy in Parliament into the man who greens the desert. And I'm about to need every friend I can make, because the rising power in the East has decided it's time to come and take a very close look at exactly what I've built. The Japanese squadron arrives in 1903, the armored cruiser Izumo and 2 escorts under Vice Admiral Yamamoto, and it's a courtesy visit the way a burglar's stroll past your house is a courtesy walk. They've come to measure me, and I've decided to let them, because a controlled look is better than a spy in the dark. They probe, politely, constantly. They admire the radio tower and ask how it works, and Barton blames the details on the Labour Party. They ask to tour the arsenal at Lithgow, and Clark blames the restrictions on a War Office audit. And in Canberra, they make 2 requests that tell me everything. They'd like to see inside the cruiser Sydney, and they'd very much like the right to use our coaling ports in the event of a war. My hands, I tell Yamamoto, spreading them with genuine regret, are tied by democracy. I cannot simply promise a foreign navy our ports. My parliament would have my head. And to soften the no, I give them a gift that costs me nothing and buys me goodwill. Our meteorological and shipping data sent over the cable. But the real game happens aboard the Sydney, and it's played by Von Beck, and it's beautiful. When the Japanese officers tour the ship, Von Beck walks them through it personally, and everywhere they most want to look, something is tragically, plausibly wrong. The main fire control director? Ugh, so embarrassing. The Zeiss vacuum lens has sprung a leak. It is apart for repair. The engine room? I must beg you not to enter. We have flooded it with inert gas for 48 hours against corrosion. It would be death to go in. They see a magnificent cruiser with all its actual secrets politely unavailable. And then comes the part I enjoy most. Their ships, sitting in our harbor, quietly tuned to our naval frequency to eavesdrop, exactly as I hoped, and Pulse is listening back, and it records their cipher traffic, and in listening to us listen to them, we capture the pattern of the Japanese naval code. Yamamoto sails away satisfied he's taken our measure. I hang the ceremonial katana he gifted me on my wall, over the desk where my cryptographers are already picking his code apart. And what the code starts telling us is that a war is coming, very soon, and it's going to hand me the chance of the century. The traffic analysis is stark. Encrypted Japanese message volume around Port Alexander and the Tsushima Strait has jumped tenfold. Somebody is about to start a war with Russia, and soon, early 1904, my people estimate. And there's a second thread. Japanese fishing boats have been taking suspiciously careful depth soundings around Palau, a stepping stone that points, if you follow the line, straight at the Torres Strait and my northern door. So I make a bold, slightly insane decision. I send the Sydney to Manila, 3 birds, 1 cruiser, rattle Japan by showing our flag in their neighborhood, embrace America by visiting the U.S. fleet in the Philippines, and test my hard-won autonomy by sending a warship on a foreign cruise and only notifying London 24 hours after she sails, daring the Admiralty to do something about it. The Sydney comes into Manila Bay at better than 15 knots, having averaged 18 the whole way from Sydney, and the Americans are frankly impressed a colonial cruiser can move like that. Her captain, Jellicoe, sits down with Fighting Bob Davies over bourbon, and the two navies feel each other out over the rims of their glasses. The English build drawing rooms that float, Davies growls. Out here a man wants a boxer. They trade careful hints about the Japanese fishermen, and Manila's radio station is quietly declared open to friends 24 hours a day. Tokyo reads the visit and revises its estimate of the annoying little power to the south. And Ramsey, back in London, reads that an Australian warship went to Manila without his leave, and reportedly turns the color of a Royal Navy ensign, screaming the word mutiny. Except it isn't mutiny. It's all perfectly within the letter of the Imperial Naval Committee I built, and there's not one thing he can do. 3 birds, 1 cruise. It's the most fun I've had since the vault. The Sydney comes home to 100,000 people on the foreshore, and that's where my own triumph springs a trap I don't see closing until it's shut. Because up on a crate over that ecstatic crowd is Alexander Jenkins, and he seizes the moment to roar 2 words that the crowd loves and I dread. White Australia! The pride of the returning warship curdles in an afternoon into something uglier, a Union and Conservative alliance, the White Fortress, suddenly commanding 2/3 of both houses, demanding an Immigration Restriction Act. And that night, Jenkins and O'Malley come to me, my own labor allies, the men I lit a furnace with, and they threaten a general strike. Not one lump of coal moves for that cruiser of yours, Jenkins says, if you stand against this. You built this nation, Alexander. Don't make us stop it. And I stand alone in my study very late, understanding the shape of the thing at last. The fortress I built to keep this country safe is turning into the cage that traps me inside its own worst instincts. How I handle that cage is the darkest, cleverest, most compromised thing I do in all these years, and I'm not sure to this day I got it right. I don't fight the White Fortress. I can't. It's 2/3 of both houses, and my own labor movement is holding a general strike over my head. Fighting it head-on loses the whole country. So I let the Immigration Restriction Act pass, 80% in favor, and I sign it without reading it, and I hate every stroke of the pen, because I know exactly what it slams the door on, the foreign brilliance that built everything I have. Sokolov, von Richthofen, Richter, Siemens, every exile who came here because the door was open. And then, 5 minutes after I sign it, I open a second, secret door around the back. A quiet decree, the Federal Business and Strategic Security Ordinance, creates a Federal Strategic Talent Introduction Agency under the CSB with the power to issue strategic visas that route clean around the act I just signed, the files sealed. Jenkins won the letter of the law. I kept its interpretation, and a back door only I hold the key to. I stand in front of my own reflection that night, and I don't much like the king looking back at me, a man who signs a law he despises with one hand and undermines it with the other, all for reasons he's certain are right. Familiar and strange, both at once. It's the price of the cage. I pay it, and I don't pretend it was free. And the back door immediately starts bringing in exactly the people the front door was built to keep out. A Japanese metallurgist named Tanaka Hiroshi, fleeing his own country's militarism, comes in under the cover name Robert Joe and hands me the formula for armor plate and submarine steel. A mathematician, Ramanujan, driven out of Cambridge by the color of his skin, walks in and takes over the Pulse code-breaking project. The very genius the act was written to exclude is now sitting in my most secret laboratories, because I refuse to let a law I was forced to sign make my country stupider. And then a telegram comes in from Wellington that changes the whole board. Ward, panicking, asking for a secret meeting, because Britain has just signed an alliance with Japan. and New Zealand suddenly feels a wolf inside the house. I read it, and something in me goes very still and very pleased. I've been waiting 10 years for this telegram, I tell Clark. Because a frightened New Zealand is a New Zealand I can finally bring all the way in. Ward comes to Canberra in the dead of night, and I put a proposal in front of him that I've been keeping in a locked drawer for a decade, the Southern Cross proposal. Full integration of defense and economy, a one-to-one exchange of our currencies, every New Zealand debt absorbed by the Royal Bank of Australia. Ward reads down the page, getting redder and redder until he explodes. This isn't a partnership. This is annexation. You're stuffing the Kiwi into the kangaroo's pouch. And then he turns to the last page and stops. Because the last page renames the whole thing. Not the Commonwealth of Australia swallowing New Zealand. A new nation, both of them inside it, equal, the Australasian Federation. It's not annexation, I tell him, quiet now. It's the creation of something bigger than either of us. And you're Maori. Look here, I show him the sealed decree on strategic partners. Every New Zealander comes in at the highest tier of citizenship, automatically. A Maori man can sit in the federal cabinet. There's no such promise anywhere in the British Empire, and you know it. Ward is quiet for a long, long time, this great, blunt bull of a man, and then he lets out a breath and says, "You are a devil. You are an absolute devil that the whole of Oceania desperately needs." And he shakes my hand. And without a single shot fired, in one night, over one clever last page, New Zealand comes in, and the country at the bottom of the world stops being Australia and becomes Australasia. Getting Ward to sign is one thing. Getting two countries to ratify it is a brawl on both sides of the Tasman. Wellington goes up in flames. A firebrand named Stafford screams betrayal that the kangaroo is devouring the Kiwi. And on my side, Jenkins and O'Malley burst into my office again, purple with rage, because absorbing a whole new population blows a hole in their precious white fortress. "You swore you'd defend it," Jenkins snarls, "and now you're merging us with anyone, and I've had enough of the fortress, so I put the thing on the table I've been holding back. The intelligence file, the Japanese soundings around Palau, the depth charts, the stepping stones aimed at our throat. Here, I tell them, this is what's actually coming, so choose, guns or butter, racial purity or national survival. Because you cannot have both, and the men taking these soundings do not care what color we are, only whether we're strong enough to stop them. The fight goes out of Jenkins when he sees those charts. The unions go quiet and let it pass. Ward, King Ted, bulls the referendum through in New Zealand with a single roaring question. Where is the Royal Navy? In the North Sea. And where is the Japanese tiger? Right there. Both nations ratify. Australasia is real, and it was born, like everything I build, half out of hope and half out of fear. And right as the new nation draws its first breath, my secret laboratories hand me two cards that change what kind of power it's going to be. The first comes off Ramanujan's desk, and it stops my heart for a second. Pulse and the mathematician have cracked the Japanese naval cipher, Type 89, wide open. And what it's saying, in plain decrypted text, is that the fleet at Sasebo is preparing a surprise attack, in the dead of winter, on the Russian fleet at Port Alexander. January, maybe February, 1904. I'm reading Japan's war plan before Japan has fired a shot. The second card actually leaves the ground. Out on a field, Stevenson's machine, the Australasia one, takes off, controlled, banking through the air on a trick I quietly suggested to him, warping the wings the way an eagle twists its wingtips to turn. 5 minutes aloft, real turns, a man steering the sky. I order 10 of them in 3 months, itted with floats so they can land alongside the Sydney. And down in Von Beck's yard, the submarine platypus is nearly ready, Tanaka's steel, 70 meters deep, but she's blind under the water. So I hand Von Beck one more idea from a future he can't see. Active sonar, shouting into the dark and listening for the echo to come back. Sokolov lights up like one of his own coils. I will hear a shrimp sneeze at 1,000 meters, he promises. I have a new nation, its enemy's war plan in my hand, aircraft in the sky, and a submarine that can hear in the dark. And then, on the 8th of February, 1904, the war I've been reading about arrives exactly on schedule. Pulse catches it live, not a decrypted plan anymore, but panic, in the clear, flooding out of Port Alexander in the middle of the night. Torpedoes, the Retvizan hit, the Tsarevich hit. The Japanese surprise attack, landing precisely where and when the cipher said it would. I gather the cabinet in the small hours, and I tell them what we're looking at. This is not a storm we shelter from, I say. This is the eastern wind, and a wind can be sailed. Strict neutrality, we take no side in the war. A neutral trade program, we sell to both sides, because two exhausted giants tearing at each other in the north is the safest thing that has ever happened to a young power in the south. The Sydney goes to battle-ready patrol, and while the great powers of the world lock their horns and bleed, the little nation at the bottom of the map has its golden window wide open. The lion and the tiger have started devouring each other in the north. Down south, the young kangaroo is done being underestimated, and it's about to show the whole Pacific exactly what its own navy can do. But first, I have to do something that surprises even me. I have to save a Russian admiral I've never met, because his death would be a disaster for Australia. The Japanese have a problem named Kolchak. Admiral Kolchak takes command at Port Alexander and single-handedly puts the spine back into the beaten Russian fleet, and Tokyo decides the war can't be won until he's dead. Their plan is elegant and lethal: mines laid across the mouth of the harbor, and a decoy squadron to lure Kolchak's flagship out over them. And here's my dilemma, and it's a cold one. A quick, total Japanese victory is the worst possible outcome for me. It leaves a triumphant, unbloodied Japan free to look south. I need this war long, and I need it exhausting. Which means, absurdly, I need Kolchak alive. So I play the Shanghai game, and it's a masterpiece of not touching anything directly. A CSB agent they call the Tailor, posing as a Russian arms dealer named Sokolov, feeds a German intelligence man named Schneider a warning about the mines, packaged as Berlin's own interest, because Russia must not be allowed to die suddenly. Schneider, smelling profit, sells the warning to the Russian consul for 50,000 gold rubles, and it reaches Kolchak as a rumor from 3 removes away. He reads it and mutters that it smells like a trap, and then, being a careful man, he shifts his flag to a different ship and sends light cruisers ahead sweeping in a zigzag. And history bends. The mine that was meant to kill him catches a different ship, the Bayan, which is holed but doesn't sink, and Kolchak survives the morning that was supposed to end him. Admiral Togo is left staring at an empty trap, snarling one word: a leak. And now the real chaos begins, because nobody knows where the leak came from. London blames Berlin, Tokyo blames London, Paris rushes fresh loans to the Russians. Everyone suspects everyone, and my fingerprints are on none of it. And the war I need grinds longer and bloodier exactly as designed. Everything, I tell my cabinet straight-faced, is going according to plan. It is the coldest sentence I have ever said, and I mean every word, and somewhere underneath the satisfaction is a small, quiet voice reminding me that I just spent human lives like counters on a table. I tell the voice to be quiet. It mostly listens. While I'm rewriting a war by rumor, I'm also finally winning the fight to sea under the ocean, and it comes down to a diesel engine and a perfectionist who'd rather die than fail. I smuggle a diesel engine out of Hamburg, through Buenos Aires, in pieces, along with the engineer who's the only man alive who can perfect it, an exiled German named Max Werner, who arrives and immediately starts a screaming match with Stevenson. Your kerosene toys, Werner sneers about the aircraft, are for little girls. Your iron doesn't fly, Stevenson fires back. I let them fight, and then I take both, because I always take both. Petrol for the sky, diesel for the deep. Werner locks himself in with his engine and promises me, with the wild eyes of a man who means it, that he'll have it running in 3 months, or I will climb inside the cylinder and be the piston myself. His diesel, the Hercules, runs a 72-hour endurance run, with Werner standing over a glowing cylinder with a wrench and fire hoses playing on the block, and the steel holds, 1,200 horsepower, a world record, and suddenly my submarines have a heart that can carry them from Sydney to Tokyo. In the north, meanwhile, the war I stretched is turning into a slaughter, and even I don't feel clever watching it. Kolchak, saved and paranoid, turns Port Alexander into a fortress fleet, guns off the ships and up onto the hills, 5,000 sailors turned into infantry. And General Oyama throws his army at those hills, and the hills stay Russian, and the cost is a number that doesn't fit in any sentence I'd want to say out loud. Industrial killing, wave after wave, for meters of dirt. I read the casualty reports and I don't make a joke, because some things you don't joke about. And I think about the men in that mud who never chose any of it. And then I do the thing my position demands. I turn the horror into an opportunity. While the lion and the tiger tear each other apart in the north, I tell Clark, the southern kangaroo is going to walk the neighborhood and show its teeth. The Sydney sails on a flag-showing cruise, Auckland, Fiji, Samoa. And on that cruise, my navy stops being a promise and becomes a fact the whole Pacific has to respect. Auckland weeps when the Sydney comes in, the new Australasians lining the shore, because it's their ship now too. And then at Suva, a German cruiser, the Geyer, comes in without notice, the old game, the same intimidation von Diedrichs pulled in Sydney Harbor a lifetime ago. Except this time, we are not the frightened little colony with the empty batteries. The Sydney Sounds battle stations, swings her turrets onto the German, and Jellicoe sends a cold, flat ultimatum. 24 hours to state your business or leave. And the Geyer, modern, German, proud, weighs a fully armed Australasian cruiser with her guns already trained, and leaves under what everyone politely agrees to call our escort. Then at Samoa, the Sydney puts a single shell into a reef 12 miles offshore, precise and unmistakable, a full stop written in seawater. The message travels the whole ocean without a word attached. South of the line, this is our backyard now. 14 years ago, I stood on a London carpet while lords laughed and called it a land of convicts and kangaroos. Tonight, a warship built in Australian yards, crewed by Australian men, just turned a German cruiser around in the South Pacific and drew a line in the sea that the great powers will respect. The boy they threw away built a nation, faced down the empire that made him, and put a navy on the water that the world has to reckon with. And the war in the north is only getting started, because the largest fleet Russia has ever sent to sea is already steaming halfway around the world toward these very waters, and when it arrives, the whole thing is going to come down to one afternoon in a narrow strait, and I intend to be the one who decides how it ends. But before I can decide anything, the war teaches me the one weakness I can't scheme my way out of. My submarines and my aircraft and my whole modern navy run on one thing I don't have: oil. Every drop of it is imported, and a nation that imports its fuel is a nation someone else can switch off. So while the great powers bleed in the north, I send a geologist named William Smith into the swamps of Papua under the cover of a survey, hunting for oil. Because I've read enough of the century that's coming to know the sentence that runs all of it. Whoever controls the oil controls the 20th century. His party gets a sample of light crude out of the ground and gets driven back out of that country fast because a war party comes down on them, defending ground that was never ours to walk into, and only the roar of a test charge scares the warriors off long enough to run. They come home with a vial of black oil and a very clear message that the land has owners. It's enough. It tells me there's oil under the empire I'm building. Now I have to go and take it before anyone else smells it. Meanwhile, up north, the war becomes the ugliest kind of business, and I run the till. There's a battle in the Yellow Sea. Koltak nearly breaks out. 2 Russian shells cripple Togo's flagship, and then Russian boilers burst at the worst moment, and the whole thing sputters into an exhausted draw, both fleets limping home with nothing decided. And a draw is money, because 2 boxers too tired to knock each other out will pay anything for one more round. So I sell them the round. A shell company called Southern United Trading moves agricultural machinery, that is Krupp artillery, and fertilizer, that is ammunition. And the Russians buy morphine by the crate, and the Japanese buy our best coal at triple price. And the profits come home and turn into keels and rails and schools. When London protests that a loyal dominion shouldn't be trading with both sides of a war, I answer with a straight face that every penny of it becomes a rivet in a ship I'll one day lend the empire. And I don't let myself look too long at where the money actually comes from, because I know exactly where it comes from, and it comes from young men drowning in the dark on both sides of a fight that isn't mine. Then London tries to drag me into that fight, and I wriggle out of it in the pettiest, most beautiful way. The Russian fleet steaming toward these waters panics off Dogger Bank and opens fire on a huddle of British fishing boats, mistaking Hull trawlermen for Japanese torpedo boats, and Britain goes berserk and orders every ship in the empire to battle readiness to intercept the Russians. Which is a trap with 2 jaws. Obey, and I'm at war with Russia. Refuse, and my hard-won autonomy is a dead letter. So I do neither. I make enormous, loud, loyal noises about British honor, and then I send my fleet steaming out with great ceremony to protect the Golden Coast, where it conducts 3 weeks of extremely thorough, extremely slow exercises in Bass Strait, thousands of miles from any Russian. Technically at battle readiness, practically on holiday. Ramsey, who is nobody's fool, sends a one-line message of thanks through his teeth because he knows precisely what I did and can't say a word about it. And through all of it, the North keeps grinding. And it stops being abstract the day Port Alexander's second assault comes in. Oyama throws his army at the fortress again, 15,000 men, and takes nothing, not a meter, and the report of it lands on my desk, and I read the number, and I put the paper down, and I don't reach for a scheme for a while. Because I engineered the length of this war. I kept Kolchak alive so it would grind, and this is the grinding. A number of dead men that I helped author, sitting on my desk in the sunshine of a country I built to be better than this. I keep a widow at Mount Gambier in a drawer in my head, the first person my ambition ever killed. I add a much bigger number to that drawer, and I make myself carry it, because a man who spends lives and doesn't feel the weight has become the very thing I sailed 8,000 miles to beat. Then I do my job. I order the impossible next weapon, an aircraft that runs on diesel, married from Stevenson's wings and Werner's engine, and I turn back to the war, and I let the drawer stay heavy. And then the war offers me its dirtiest deal yet, and I take it with both hands. Kuznetsov's great Russian fleet, rotting and desperate on its endless voyage, sends a secret request. May it use the port of Darwin to coal and resupply. Refuse, and they might shell my undefended northern town on their way past. Agree openly, and I'm at war with Japan and Britain both. Politics, I tell my cabinet, is not a choice, it's a proof. So I do both. In public, ringing and righteous, I refuse. All Australasian ports closed to the belligerent Russian fleet, how dare they ask? And in secret, in a quiet bay near Darwin, Southern United sells them 60,000 tons of the worst brown coal in the country, ancient tinned beef, and quinine at triple price. Kuznetsov's men curse us for robbers, as they load garbage fuel that'll trail smoke visible for miles. And on the way out the door, I slip the Japanese a quiet piece of false intelligence, that the Russians are making for Cam Bay. 3.5 million pounds in profit, a Russian fleet sabotaged with its own coal bunkers, and both sides more confused than ever, and every bit of it deniable. It is a genuinely despicable piece of work, and it is exactly the right one, and those two facts have stopped being contradictions in my head, which is maybe the thing about this job that should frighten me most. The Russian fleet is limping toward its doom on my bad coal, and I already know exactly where I want that doom to happen. Port Alexander finally falls in the dead of winter. The Japanese take the high ground at last, drag their siege guns up, and sink the trapped Russian fleet at anchor. And General Oyama walks away from his victory, having buried both his sons in the getting of it. A whole ocean of striving ended, and the day the news comes, I don't mourn it and I don't cheer it. I look at what it means for me. The lion and the tiger in the north have chewed each other to the bone, I tell the cabinet. It's time the kangaroo showed its teeth for real, and my teeth, it turns out, are nearly ready. The diesel aircraft, the Seahawk, has flown 12 hours and 1,000 kilometers. The submarine Orca can strike blind at 5 kilometers by sound alone. But all of it drinks oil I don't own, so I bet the Treasury on fixing that forever. I break ground on Kwinana, a second Newcastle, an entire industrial city and refinery raised in the empty desert of Western Australia on the shore of the Indian Ocean. No water for 300 miles, granite that eats machines, 50,000 workers, a budget half again the size of the Transcontinental Railway. I put an engineer named Edward Carter in charge of it. Welcome to the construction site from hell, he tells his own men, cheerfully, and I route the whole thing around Parliament through a company I chair, and I quietly bring my strategic exiles in through the back door to build it. Give Carter 5 years, I tell Thornton, and our submarines will fuel themselves on our own oil. After that, no one on Earth can switch us off. The oil in Papua I simply go and take, sending private men and hard security into that country to hold the ground the crude sits under, because that's the ugly arithmetic of fuel, and I've stopped pretending otherwise. And the war keeps handing me raw material for the world I'm building. When the Tsar's soldiers gun down his own people on Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg, Jenkins wants me to condemn Russia and cut all trade, and I refuse, because a stable Russia is useless to me, and a collapsing one is a gold mine. Instead, I quietly send £1 million to the Russian revolutionaries, every faction of them, to blow up the Trans-Siberian and keep the chaos boiling, while I keep selling the Tsar bread and vodka with the other hand. Jenkins stares at me when he works out what I've done and says, half horrified, You're an actual revolutionary. I let him think whatever keeps him useful, and I trade my secrets to a giant for the tools to build bigger ones. Berlin, thanks to von Beck's reports, is losing sleep over my submarines. Admiral Donitz calls the sonar a devil's ear, so I offer the Germans a swap, the sonar plans, in exchange for their best fuel injectors and, the real prize, their maps of the oil under the Dutch East Indies. One of Doukitz's men sizes me up and gets it exactly right. He is not a British prince, and he is not Germany's friend. He is Alexander of Australasia, and he tips whichever scale keeps him on top. Donitz makes the trade anyway, because he can't help himself, and I get my oil maps. First step, acquired. Then I put all the new toys on the table at once, and it changes what war is going to mean. In a bay called Jervis, I run the first exercise of its kind in the history of the world. An aircraft in the sky spots the target. A submarine 70 meters down hears it. And the cruiser Sydney, using both sets of eyes, puts 2 torpedoes into a target ship from 6,500 yards away, blind, over the horizon, guided by sound and wings. Captain Jellicoe watches the target die and goes pale. God almighty, he says, if that had been the Sydney. And then he asks me for the entire naval budget to build a fleet of them, because he's just seen the future, and the future is that the biggest gun no longer wins. The best eyes win. Which is exactly why my most important recruit in all of this isn't an admiral. He's a 26-year-old clerk in a Swiss patent office. His name is Max Planck, and half of Europe thinks he's a crank, and the other half hasn't heard of him. And I've read enough of the century to know he's neither. He's the man who's going to rewrite what reality is. I send Barton to Bern with an offer no university in Europe will make, a patent clerk, president of a Royal Australasian Academy of Sciences, a salary 20 times what Zurich's insulting him with, and a professorship for his wife Sophia in her own name. And the hook that actually lands isn't the money. It's a question I have Barton plant, a question about gravity and the speed of light, and how they might bend together that I know will sit in his head and never let him sleep. Planck reads the offer and says the thing that tells me I've got him. Europe is my homeland, he says, but truth is my only country. This is not an exile. It is the holy land of 20th century physics. I'm coming. Sophia comes as Professor Petrova. I've just bought the mind that's going to unlock the century, and I bought it because everyone smarter sounding than me was too proud to. I have the oil, the aircraft, the submarine, the sonar, and the greatest physicist who will ever live. And out in the Indian Ocean, the doomed Russian fleet is finally staggering toward the narrow strait where I mean to end this whole war on my own terms. Kuznetsov's 42 ships crawl into Camaran Bay for one last rest, trailing black smoke from my garbage coal so thick you can see the fleet from miles before you see the sea. And somewhere out in the dark, Admiral Togo has gone silent, total radio blackout, his fleet vanished, waiting to spring the perfect trap in the Tsushima Strait. Everyone's waiting on one battle now. The whole war, the whole balance of the Pacific, comes down to which way 2 blind fleets stumble into each other in one narrow channel. So I decide to do the stumbling for them. I call it Ghost Echo, and it's the most dangerous lie I've ever told, because I tell it to 2 fleets at once. My Seahawks, flying high with cameras, find Togo's hidden main force tucked in a bay where no one's looking. Now I know where both fleets are, and neither of them knows the other. So I forge 2 messages. To Kuznetsov, on a frequency he trusts, through a mole in the ruins of Port Alexander, I send a ghost, a signal dressed up as the dead Kolchak's own hand. Do not turn aside. Break straight through the strait. Glory is ahead. And to Togo, laundered through Russian nihilist chatter, I whisper the opposite poison. The Russians know about your ambush. They're going to come straight down the middle and try to smash through. Be ready for a head-on fight. 2 admirals, each certain he's read the other's mind, both of them steering, on my word, into a head-on collision in the dead center of the strait. And on the 27th of May, 1905, at Tsushima, they hit exactly where I aimed them. Togo doesn't get his perfect trap, the graceful crossing maneuver every naval officer dreams of. He gets a brawl. The two fleets slam together bow to bow in the strait, and it's not elegant, it's a knife fight between battleships at close range. A Russian shell smashes into Togo's flagship and puts a splinter through the admiral himself. But the Japanese gunners are better, and their shells are deadlier, and over one long, terrible afternoon, the great Russian fleet that sailed halfway around the world simply stops existing, sunk, burning, or surrendered. Kuznetsov himself pulled from the water, a prisoner. Japan wins the battle of the century. And Japan loses too, which is the entire point, and the part nobody but me is looking at. Because it was a brawl, not a masterstroke, and brawls cost the winner too. Togo's flagship is wrecked, and half his best ships are crippled. The victorious Japanese Navy limps home with its spine cracked, having spent everything it had to win. A clean, surgical Japanese victory would have left a triumphant fleet free to turn south and look at me. Instead, I engineered a head-on wreck that broke both of them. The Tiger won its war and can barely stand. A week in Japan, I tell my cabinet quietly, looking at the casualty lists of a battle I steered without firing a shot, is the best possible Japan for Australasia. And I mean it, and I also don't look too long at the sea full of drowned men on both sides, because I've learned to hold those two things at once, and I've stopped expecting the second one to ever feel good. The war is over, and for the young nation at the bottom of the world, the harvest is just beginning. Both empires are shattered and broke. The Tsar's throne is cracking, Japan's treasury is empty. And Australasia, neutral, intact, 12 million pounds richer, with the only fresh modern fleet left standing in the Pacific, walks out of the wreckage as the quiet winner of a war it never officially fought. President Davies is already sending word, come to Portsmouth, help write the peace. The great powers who could not find Australia on a map 15 years ago now need it in the room where the world gets carved up. Let me tell you where this started. 15 years ago, I stood on a carpet in a London drawing room, a disgraced boy, while the finest men of the empire laughed and handed me a continent of convicts and kangaroos to rot in. My own father wanted me buried in India. My grandmother was the only living soul who believed I was worth a single coin of hope. Tonight, I run a nation of my own making that just quietly decided the outcome of the biggest war of the age. I built it out of 6 arguments and an empty map. I forged its steel, laid its rails, lit it with lightning pulled from the air, taught it to speak to itself over the wireless, gave it a navy that turns great powers around in their tracks, and a fleet of mines pulled from every place too proud to use them. I went back to the drawing room that laughed at me and made the empire itself sit down and treat me as an equal. And I did not fail the one person who believed in me before there was anything to believe in. I didn't disgrace the name, grandmother, I say, and I close my hand around a piece of iron that fell out of a sky with no borders on it. I think you'd have walked inside and wept. But here's the thing about winning this big, this young. When you're a boy, nobody notices. You're free. And I am not a boy nobody notices anymore. Kaiser Wilhelm eyes my fleet and wonders whether he can turn me into a dagger aimed at Britain. London has finally understood that the daughter has outgrown the mother and doesn't quite know whether to embrace her or fear her. Japan has learned my name and written it in the ledger of enemies to settle with later. And across every chancellery in Europe, powerful men are looking at the little nation at the bottom of the map and asking the same question, the one that turns a free man into a hunted one. Whose side is he on? The boy they threw away is now the man the empires can't stop watching. They're all going to come for a piece of him, with a fleet, with a treaty, or with a bride. And that's a story for next time, because right now, there's a piece to go and rewrite at Portsmouth, and a whole new century waiting for someone to build it. Australasia is awake, and it's only just getting started.